Greater Northside Management. Thanks, Wendy. Our growing initiative to be innovative and to try something that's different. So the Greater Northside Management District was able to get some what people might call beautification, but we will only walk where we feel safe. And so what we're doing is we're incrementally improving our environment to make sure that we bring active transportation to all neighborhoods within our communities. One second, it seems like we have a delay again. Okay, for our upcoming speakers, just so you know, it does stick a little bit, so you'll have to maneuver that or go to the bottom of the slide and then you'll be able to have your arrows come up and I'll point that out. So why are we here today? Essentially, we're here today because of that 2021 evaluation that we did of the program. You know, when we did our first evaluation, what we heard from our local sponsors is it would be really nice if you guys could map recommendations for us. It'd be nice if you could track them, and then it'd be nice if you could make them publicly available. And we did all that. And so now with this 2021 feedback, the next thing we heard was, well, we have limited funds, right? And we all experienced this. We have limited funds, and how can we bring down more money? How can we find more money? How can we leverage our resources so that we can continue growing our projects and not spend our budget all at once? And so we really started to think about what that would look like. And we thought, gosh, for this year's land use and transportation workshop, we may not know all the answers, but let's go ahead and tackle the question. And so that's why we're here today. I just wanted to explain a little bit of background that led us to the speakers we have. So everybody received a packet as you signed in. And for the virtual community, we're going to make this packet available to you through the chat, and Wendy will be releasing that. You have an agenda, and in our agenda, you'll notice that there's a break at 10:45. And the break really kind of also breaks sort of the presenters, if you will. So our first set of presenters are going to be kind of laying the stage for what we're doing in the field, what they're experiencing in terms of active transportation implementation. We are going to be starting off with Monisha Khurana, who's actually going to talk about performance-based criteria. So how do you select your projects and understand what pipeline they're going to go into for funding based on what set of criteria? We're then going to hear an example from a recent study that's just been done, our North Houston Livable Center study, which was completed 2 years ago. So fresh out of the gate. So we're going to hear about the logic. How did they go about getting started towards implementation? How did they get their funds? How did they diversify their funds? And then we're also going to acknowledge, hey, some of these studies have been around for a while. And so we're going to hear from the city of Houston. And the city of Houston is going to really talk about 2 locations where they're piloting some active transportation projects. And they were old livable center locations that got absorbed through complete communities. And again, funding runs out. So how are they diversifying their funds, even though they've been working on this for just a bit? So we're trying to hit these different points in time as we talk about this. And then after the break, we're actually going to hear about our programs that are here and available for you today at HGAC. Because what we want to do is we want you to leave today understanding what our tools are and what resources you have available to start working towards implementation. And I'll introduce the HGAC staff individually as they come up. Before I pass this over to our first speaker, I do want to point out that you have a few handouts. So the first handout, and this is going to pertain to Monisha's presentation, is funding sources, where she talks about just that. And so you go ahead and make sure you take out your pen, your virtual pencil, and write down your notes. The next one I want to point out, and this was put together by our transportation staff, is the understanding of CMAQ funds, what CMAQ funds are, and then what are some of their defined examples and funding examples. Then you'll have one more, it's called self-screening and preparation. This is going to be presented by Adam Beckham this afternoon. And again, this is getting into how can you self-screen to prep and understand what your project should be. And then finally, you will have an evaluation form. So I just wanted to explain what was in the packet to make sure that you guys are well-versed and understand that those tools are at your disposal as we move through today's presentation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our first speaker, Monisha Khurana. She's the Chief Operations Officer at the Goodman Corporation. She has a history in travel demand modeling. She has a decade of experience, and she is very well versed on mobility strategies and performance-based plans. So with that, Monisha, I'm going to have you come up, and I'm going to give you a quick cheat sheet on how to move through these slides so you don't get stuck. Okay. Thank you. All right. Can everyone hear me? We good? Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Anita, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's great to be here, and looking forward to today's discussion. Today, my presentation is going to talk about project development and evaluation in particular, talking about the Goodman Corporation and how we identify needs, evaluate projects, find partnerships, and attract discretionary funding. All right. So the problem statement is that we live in communities that have more infrastructure and mobility needs than funding available. And our objective is to use livable center studies and other planning studies that have been done to find the priority projects and use our performance-based funding strategy to help find additional funding through developing projects. Can you hear me? Okay, is that better? Oh, that sounds really loud. Okay, sounds good. All right. So when we go into a community to do this process, we have some goals that we hope to achieve. Ideally, we'd like to involve the community and the stakeholders, and this might have already been done through the Livable Centers process. We take a data-driven approach, which we'll talk more about in the next few slides. And even though we might only pick a few projects to focus on, we want to understand why we're picking those and what are the other projects. Is there a particular reason that they're not being developed? Is it not a priority? Do they have lesser need, or are they just more complex? And once we have these projects, we go through the development and evaluation process to prepare them for discretionary funding. In terms of outcomes from our process, funding obviously from other entities is a great outcome, but even if the projects are not selected for discretionary funding, they're sufficiently developed and the entities hopefully have a good enough understanding of their costs, their benefits, and if they want to implement them themselves, they have an idea of what that might entail. So our process is generally in 5 phases. And so the next few slides will go through all of those phases. So the first one is doing a needs assessment. And what we do is we review studies that have been done before. So in this case, we would look at a livable center study. And from there, we look at what was the public input that was done. And that might help us understand what are the priorities of the residents and the stakeholders. Sometimes we supplement the public involvement. We've done surveys, we've done in-person and virtual meetings recently. And what we try to do is we try to ask people, like, what is your greatest mobility need, or what kinds of mobility needs do you have? And from there, we're able to find out the community's priorities. So we might learn that safety is important to a community, or connectivity to a school or a park, or congestion is a problem. And sometimes we're able to find out specific projects that the community wants. They want a sidewalk on this road, or they want a signal at this intersection. And going back to the study, we can also get an idea of what were those goals and objectives from a mobility perspective. And looking at the projects and the recommendations that were in there, what's the need for those, and what was the scope, and how can we use that to build upon?
And at this stage, we've also found it helpful to coordinate with other stakeholders and entities such as flood control, the city of Houston, the county, to understand what their plans are for the area so that we either don't conflict with what they're doing or we're able to use what they have in the pipeline to find some synergies with what we're trying to do. So once we develop a list of corridors or preliminary project ideas, we then move to the next step of the needs assessment. And that is a data-driven exercise. It's a dynamic screening tool, is a good way to put it. And we call it our needs-based analysis. And this is often done at the corridor level. So we start with 10 or 15 corridors, and we narrow it down to the top few of the greatest need. And each metric gets a point value, and all of these corridors are ranked relative to each other. And all of these categories are weighted. And within the different categories, there's different things that we look at. For example, for safety, we look at the City of Houston and Harris County's high injury network. We look at TxDOT data for actual crashes, especially with sidewalk projects, or if we're considering active transportation projects, we want to make sure that we are looking at corridors that have actual pedestrian and bike crashes. For mobility, we consider traffic volumes, what the pavement condition might be like, and what kind of congestion is on that corridor. Access is another important thing to consider. This is a really broad category, and for each community, what they value might be different. So some communities are really focused on transit, so we'll make sure to look at transit connections to schools and parks. Those can be universal. And again, this criteria is pretty flexible, so we're able to add and remove things depending on the community and their needs. Another category is economic development, and this is a proxy to see how might an infrastructure project impact economic development, looking at the existing businesses and jobs along the corridor and thinking about what's already there in terms of property value, or is there maybe some vacant land that can be redeveloped in conjunction with an infrastructure project. Another category which has gotten a lot of attention in the last few years is environmental justice and equity. And some of the metrics that we can look at is we can look at census data to look at the minority populations, the households without a vehicle, lower income populations. And then we can also look at the tracts of persistent poverty, as well as the CDC Social Vulnerability Index to prioritize those areas that have the greatest need. And in this particular example, we use public engagement as our sixth category. And in this case, there was a survey done, and we had folks rank corridors. So we were able to also integrate the public involvement into this data-driven exercise. Okay. This next slide shows how different factors can be weighted. And in this case, safety and access were the top factors. But again, this can change based on what's important in the funding landscape, what the stakeholders want, and they can change as our profession changes too. As you'll see in the next slide, we actually use stormwater and drainage as a criteria, and that's becoming increasingly more important in the Houston region as well. So once we do this analysis in Excel and we determine the weights, then we're able to pick the top few corridors and projects that will go on to our next step. And oftentimes we pick 3 or 4 to move forward with, and we generally check in with the client, and then sometimes we'll go back to the stakeholders and the public just to make sure that they're okay with us moving forward with these corridors before we get into the detailed project development. And in this next slide here, this is an example from the Near Northwest Management District here in Houston. We did this performance-based planning exercise for them. We identified a list of projects and corridors to look at based on their livable center study, as well as some other studies that were done. There's a complete community study, there's the Vision Zero, the Houston Bike Plan, the Houston CIP, HEAC's RTP. There was a mobility study in the area. We looked at Metro Next, and we looked at the City of Houston's MTFP. And as you can see here, this needs-based analysis shows how the rankings play out. You have your overall project ranking, and then you have different categories that each have their top projects in there as well. And as I mentioned, this tool is dynamic. So in the case of Near Northwest, we had used a variety of different project types. We had some reconstructions and we also had some active transportation only projects. If you wanted to only look at sidewalks, as I think Bart will talk about in his presentation, you can just focus on a certain set of criteria. And if you want to compare your sidewalk projects against your roadway projects, you can do two tools. So there's really a lot of flexibility here. One thing that I should mention is that this tool is cost agnostic. It does not account for costs. That's brought in at another step. But what we found is that the longer corridors and the ones that likely will be more costly also tend to have more needs. All right. So now we've understood our corridors. We know what we're moving forward with. And now we look at each one of them and see, how do we achieve our mobility objectives? And this is the stage where our engineering staff gets involved. And they help to determine the scope of the project. And through their conceptual engineering, we figure out what's feasible and what will it cost. And anything is feasible with unlimited money, but our goal is to create a project that meets the need and is actually implementable, given the constraints with right-of-way, with utilities, and environmental issues. One example here that I'll use is Alabonson, which is also in Near Northwest. And in this case, there was 60 feet of right-of-way. And the challenge was, how do we accommodate as many users as possible? There are two travel lanes here that need to stay intact, but how can we maximize bicycle and pedestrian connectivity? And with the right-of-way constraints, it can only really fit 2 6-foot sidewalks. But is it possible that we can add a shared use path on one side and maybe narrow the width on the other side so that we can also accommodate bicycle users, since it connects to White Oak Bayou and there's a lot of parks in the area? The other challenge of Alabonson is that there's a lot of drainage issues on this corridor that need to be addressed. And even just a sidewalk upgrade or building a sidewalk would require more drainage needs just beyond your standard piping. We had scoped a total reconstruction for this roadway with sidewalks, but in coordination for this project, we found out that the city of Houston and the flood control district were doing a nearby project having to do with drainage near the Inwood Golf Course. And through this coordination, the city of Houston actually let the district use the detention from this adjacent project for this one. So that saves the district a lot of money. And it also allows for more flexibility in the cross section to accommodate those bike and pedestrian users. So some things to keep in mind in this step and to be mindful of. So in conceptual engineering, how can we make sure to be inclusive of all users given the design standards? And especially with a reconstruction project, we really have the opportunity to redesign who the roadway is for and how best to accommodate automobiles, transit, and bike ped. And in this step, we don't have to have all the problems of the corridor solved, but especially with drainage and right away, understanding what are the issues that might come up and having some sort of semblance of a solution to understand if this project is actually feasible. And now we get to step 3, and this is where we look at specific projects in question. This is a step where we look at societal benefits. We look at this qualitatively and quantitatively. There's different types of benefits that are applicable to different projects. So if it's a pedestrian and bicycle project, how many new users and trips will be on this facility? And these are trip conversions from automobile to an active transportation mode. And this leads to things like savings in automobile costs for people driving their cars less, environmental benefits due to fewer vehicles on the road, and health benefits for people who are now using this active mode of transportation. Qualitatively, for an active transportation project, we can think about how does it improve access and connectivity? Does it eliminate a barrier over a major roadway? Does it now connect to a park or a school that's important for the community? And in looking at roadway projects, especially reconstructions, there's benefits from state of good repair, meaning that it is less costly to repair a roadway, or sorry, to rebuild the roadway versus maintaining it throughout 20 years over the life cycle. Intersection projects often have some travel time savings with improvements. To find those out, that usually involves some sort of traffic modeling to get there. The benefit cost analysis itself is a subset of the evaluation, and this is where we quantify the benefits. We use US DOT methodologies as our base. And as I had mentioned, the screening tool is cost agnostic, but now this is where we bring the costs in. And we want to ensure that we're making wise decisions with public dollars. And that's what the funding agencies are looking for too. So the benefit cost ratio needs to be greater than 1. And that shows that this project has societal benefits and it's cost effective. And in our experience, we found that it is really difficult to get a project funded if it's under 1. And one thing to note here is that different funding agencies and programs have different methodologies sometimes. So the actual analysis might change depending on the funding program or the agency. One example is that in our methodology, we tend to look at economic benefits, like an increase in property values, because that will often benefit, let's say, TERS. However, that is not something that the feds accept because they consider that as a transfer benefit. All right, so now you have a project that meets the need of your community. It has a positive BCA, the stakeholders like it, so now what? In order to get it ready for implementation, there's a few extra steps and coordinations. The first thing is establishing your right-of-way and utility agreements. And this is figuring out who do you need to work with. TxDOT needs to be consulted if it's on their roadway, but even if it's connecting, they need to be consulted. And figuring out who's responsible for the maintenance and operating costs. And if there's a management district, where can they come in and help out? And whose standards are being followed? Is it the city? Is it the county? Is it TxDOT? If you go above and beyond, who's going to maintain that for the life cycle of the project? In terms of utilities, conflicts happen, but understanding who are the parties involved and are they going to need to move their facilities? For financial commitments, figuring out where is the money coming from? One thing to keep in mind is that discretionary funding is generally on a reimbursable basis. So the entity that's seeking funding will have to be able to front the initial project costs. And reimbursements can take some time and they can be time consuming. So just making sure that there's enough cash flow through the whole process for the bid phase, for the letting, for the construction, because you'll have to pay the contractors and how fast are you going to go through that cash. For coordination and agreements, grant agreements need to be obligated in advance of spending funds. So making sure that there's actually authority to spend the money. Developing project schedules. Project schedules sometimes in the beginning are ideals, and then they tend to get shifted because your design team and the contracting team, as you get to it, they might have their own spin on the schedules. Something else that can also hold up the schedule is environmental clearance. And in our project development process, we do a desktop environmental review to find out if there's going to be any fatal flaws. And this is a little tricky because a full environmental review can be costly, but sometimes the entity doesn't have the funding to do it, but the funders want an environmental review that's already done. So there's the ability to get caught up in a chicken and egg cycle here. So our rule of thumb is that if the project does not add travel lanes or a lot of extra impervious surface, or it's not a new roadway, it will probably classify for a categorical exclusion, a CE, and that takes a few months to get. Now, if you're talking about like a regionally significant project, you're adding a new roadway, you're adding a lot of impervious surface, you're probably looking at an environmental assessment or an EIS, which will take 1 to 2 years, and that can impact your project schedule. And as you work toward the 30% design for engineering, that'll further help refine the costs and understand more about the project and potential challenges. The last item on this slide is the concept of a letter of no prejudice. And this is applicable to FTA projects. The FTA can provide permission to incur funds without authority, which is known as pre-award authority. And what this is saying is that if you follow the federal rules in advance, that you can get reimbursed later. So if you treat activities like they are federally funded, following those clauses and going through the requirements for the procurements when you issue RFQs and such, then you can get funded later. And we've actually seen similar clauses come up recently in some of the grant opportunities that have been released with the FRA and reconnecting communities. All right, so now we get to project implementation. So this is the time to advertise and talk about your project, get buy-in, and figure out who has an interest in your project and how can you go about targeting relevant funding opportunities. One good example of this in action is the Quitman Street project in the Greater Northside Management District. It's from Houston to Elysian. And this corridor, the Quitman corridor, was originally identified in the Northside Livable Center study. That Livable Center study encouraged pedestrian and streetscape improvements within streets that are in close proximity to transit stations. And this corridor was also identified in some future plans as well. There was a sub-regional mobility study in the Heights and Northside area, and then the Greater Northside District did their own pedestrian and access transit master plan. In 2015, the Quitman Pedestrian Enhancements Project was submitted to HEAC's call for projects. The scope of that was to reconstruct sidewalk and add pedestrian amenities, and that had a cost of $1.6 million. And while this funding was obtained and before construction started, there was some coordination with other entities, which found that there were actually other plans for this corridor. Metro wanted to add bike lanes and upgrade transit stops. Harris County had an interest in this because of the newly built Castillo Community Center, so they were interested in enhancing connectivity to that. And the city of Houston was planning mill and overlay. So now this has become a partnership project with all 4 entities working together to improve Quitman. And through a series of interlocal agreements, the management district is holding the construction contract, but all 4 entities are putting money in. And the construction is anticipated to be completed soon, I think early next year. But this is just a really great example of how a livable center's idea can lead to funding, can lead to coordination, and turns into an $8 million signature corridor project. This next slide is what is in your packets as a handout. This just provides a small snapshot of some funding resources by category. Everything in here is under one category, but in actuality, some of these programs kind of bridge multiple. So just a little note about that. As we all know, there's a lot of money right now coming down the pipeline, and keeping track of it is a challenge. And one thing to keep in mind is that not everything is relevant to everybody. But HEAC will be talking more about funding later on in this presentation, but hopefully this handout will be a good resource just to have in your back pocket. And now that we've gone through our process and some funding opportunities, I'm going to talk about 3 examples of clients that we've worked with in the last few years and how we've used our process to develop, evaluate projects, and get some funding. So the first example is the city of Dayton. So we'll go over to Liberty County on the east side of our region. We did a mobility plan for them in 2018. And Dayton has some interesting challenges. They have a need for pedestrian connectivity, especially to their schools. And they're anticipating a lot of growth due to the Grand Parkway expansion. And they also have railroad crossings through their town. They have the UPRR line, which goes parallel and also crosses their US 90, which is the major thoroughfare that goes through their town. And that leads to some connectivity challenges. We worked with them to develop projects. We had a mix of roadway and sidewalk projects. Through our project development process, and we had 4 funding successes for them. In 2018, we applied for a roadway project through HEAC's call for projects. It was a roadway extension to provide traffic relief, and it would also provide an alternate pedestrian connection to a school, which is important to them. This did not get funded, but it got chosen for the 2045 HEAC RTP. As I mentioned, there's pedestrian connectivity issues there, and we were able to identify a sidewalk that would connect the downtown, the community center, a residential neighborhood, and an elementary school. And that was funded via the TxDOT Transportation Alternative and Safe Routes to School program back in 2019. We also identified some spot pedestrian improvements and sidewalks in the downtown, and that was funded via the CDBG program through the Texas Department of Agriculture. And as I mentioned, the railroads is a big issue there. We pursued design and environmental funds to look at 4 intersections in the town. And we wanted to consider an overpass to help with the connectivity and the emergency access issues. So the city was funded to study that in design and environmental through the CRISI program. Next example is Waller, and Anita, I know you touched upon this briefly, but the Livable Center study was done, I guess, over 10 years ago now, and it really became a catalyst for redevelopment for Waller. And one of the reasons for doing the study itself was because major residential developers wanted to know what was going to happen in downtown Waller. And their EDC, their Economic Development Corporation, was primarily interested in industrial and commercial development, but they saw this program as an opportunity to dig into the future of downtown. So the study was completed, as Anita mentioned. There were a number of projects that were proposed, and some of these were eligible for federal grant funding. And because Waller County is economically disadvantaged, they can eliminate and or reduce their local match requirements. So as Anita mentioned, 2013, there was a call for projects application through HEAC. Eventually, those projects were built in 2018 in conjunction with a brand new city hall, and that set the foundation for a civic plaza. And that was the public investment side. But at the same time, there was also a lot of private investment in Waller at the same time. And you can see here on the slide some photos of the new restaurants. There's a brewery. And just outside of the downtown also, there was new commercial development. Further outside of Waller too, there was some additional development with a residential community, Beacon Hill, and the Daikon Goodman manufacturing facility. And that really just stimulated a lot of job growth in the whole area. And in building upon this initial success, there was additional money from TxDOT via the TA SRTS program on a couple of different roadways in 2019 and 2021. And that's further increasing the connectivity within and to and from the downtown. Right now, we have some further sidewalk projects that will be submitted to HAC's call for projects coming up, as well as TxDOT. They have an upcoming TA call for projects that will be released this fall. And this is just a really great example of how Livable Centers has helped Waller become what it is today, and how development interests were interested in economic development, and how the Livable Center study was able to cast that vision. And we were fortunate enough to work with the city leadership and the EDC to make that happen. All right, so getting a little bit closer to downtown, we've done some work with the International Management District. This is a more recent example. We're still working with them right now. The International Management District is in Southwest Houston around Beltway 8. And they had a 2019 Livable Centers study done. And you can see on the slide, you can see how they identified some corridors to look at. And then you can see the 12 initial corridors that we looked at for the analysis. And really the Livable Center study had a huge impact on how we picked our corridors to analyze. So for them, we did a corridor needs-based analysis. We looked at safety, mobility, access, economic development, environmental justice, and complete communities. We had 6 evaluation criteria with 27 metrics. And for the district, they were most interested in safety and geographic equity. And we also did an intersection safety analysis for them as well, since safety is very important. We looked at the feasibility of 7 of those 12 projects, and then we developed the top 4. So those 4 projects included 2 signature roadway reconstructions. We also did an intersection safety program and a sidewalk and school access program for them. And currently, we're in the pursuit of funding phase. We've submitted these projects to the interest list for the upcoming HAC call for projects. And there's really been a focus on safety for this client. And we coordinated with the city of Houston. So 2 of the 5 intersections in the intersection safety program are going to be submitted under the city's applications for the Safe Streets and Roads for All program. There's also another Safe Routes to School project that will be submitted under that umbrella as well. The whole intersection safety program was submitted to Representative Al Green under the House Appropriations Committee for consideration of an earmark. We've submitted one intersection for funding for the TxDOT HSIP program. And again, this is a recent program, but it is showing how we were able to take a livable center study, look at corridors, look at areas, develop projects, and hopefully we'll get funding and be able to get some safety improvements on the ground. And that's all I have. You want me to stay up here for?
Yeah, actually, I'm just going to sit here for now and say thank you. But yeah, do we have any questions in the room based on the presentation given? And actually, I'm going to start with the first one. You know, as you were going through your presentation, and I was thinking about having maybe just finished my livable center study and thinking about this 5-step process and trying to understand, you know, how to get started. And if I were to approach this performance-based criteria and decide that I wanted to take this to, for example, to my city council, or take this to kind of get started, what would be, is there a recommendation, for example, in terms of thinking about a project area in scale? And then is there a recommendation to, so sort of the initial steps to approach your community to say, hey, you know, we've done this planning process, we've spent these dollars. We always hear that communities can be over planned and over studied. How do we address the idea of plan versus performance-based criteria, kind of talking about that this is an additional step that should be taken after a plan, because it does reflect and provide long-term benefit in terms of project identification and cost ratio benefits.
Sure. So I think, I don't know if you can hear me. I think livable center studies are a great starting point. They have a lot of great recommendations, and the way that we see them is that they kind of set the vision for the area and the overall idea of what we want this community to look like. And then our project development process really focuses on what are those specific areas of need and how can we further develop those recommendations to something that is implementable and that can get on the ground and attract funding. I think that, you know, a line on the map is a great starting point, but to get from there to attracting discretionary funding, there's a lot of interim work that needs to get done.
And then my follow-up question is, you talked about project readiness, and then you talked about creating quote unquote project timelines. When communities start this process, this longer process, do you often reflect or guide sort of the overall timeline associated with each of these steps? And if for those listening today, what's a good way for them to think about this 5-step process and to think about how that might fit into their timeline of, you know, post-plan implementation?
Sure. So I think with the individual project schedule, just understanding that building in enough lead time to account for things that might take a little bit longer, I think that helps. And then I guess in terms of like this overall process, you know, when we develop our projects, we can identify sometimes with the top 4, we'll realize that some of these are short-term projects that can be achieved quickly. And as we develop projects, when we realize, you know, this project might require some additional right-of-way, or this is a really expensive project that's going to require a lot of extra funding, then we'll bucket those into long-term.
Great. And just out of curiosity, in this room, how many of us have gone through a performance-based criteria process? Okay. Very good. I think so. About half the room has some familiarity with it in terms of moving forward with it within your individual communities. Well, with that, actually, since I'm sitting here, thank you, Anisha, for your time. Another round of applause, please.
Thank you, everyone.
And folks, I do want to say one more thank you to Monisha. She really said, gosh, we're going to go process. And so instead of just storytelling, we really dove into the nuts and bolts of what it takes. Because I think we often see the pretty pictures of the final product, but no one really talks about what it takes to get there. And so when we were thinking about putting this workshop together, the original title was actually Getting Shovel Ready. And what we realized is that not everybody knows how to get to the shovel, right? To make it ready. And that was really the point of this presentation, was to say, let's take a step back and say, when you're just starting, what are the things that you should be thinking about, and what are the tools that are available that you can take to your city municipalities to really understand how to move these projects forward. And so we're going to hear a little bit about that in terms of what it takes from a management district perspective. I want to introduce Bart Baker. He is the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer for the North Houston District. In his role, he works with the President to set the direction and strategy for plans for all departments. He also oversees the Operations, Planning, and Infrastructure Department, which includes services and projects related to transportation, mobility, beautification, and areas public parks and trail system. So with that, please help me welcome Bart Baker.
Very good. All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Everyone here familiar with where the North Houston District is? You probably know. We have some thumbs up. So that's 12 square miles at the intersection of Interstate 45 and Beltway 8. We're within the city of Houston and unincorporated Harris County. So I'm here today to talk about our livable center study, the North Houston Greens Point Livable Center Study that was completed in 2020. And actually, this is a very new study. So we're at the very beginning process of trying to figure out how to navigate through all the numerous recommendations that came out of this plan. And actually, very nicely with some of the things that Manisha had presented in her presentation. Anita, I'm noticing that I have up here an image of the tracking report that HGAC prepared for us, and I call it a report card. So hopefully I don't know if we're at an A+ yet, but we're getting there. So we've just started this process. A little bit about the study area real quick. We have a lot of mixed uses in this area. So our area is a major activity center in a suburban part of the city. We have a lot of mixed uses. We have office space, we have retail, and we have a high concentration of multifamily housing. So a lot of people working here, a lot of people living here as well. Also, you can see on that image, one of the key features, geographic features of our area is Greens Bayou does cut through right through our district. Greens Bayou, a major watershed that has offered some flooding challenges for us over the years, but also many opportunities for parks and trail connectivity through our district. I'll also mention quickly too, we had a very diverse stakeholder committee on this study. City of Houston, Harris County, Flood Control, Parks Board, Metro, and many others. So a lot of the major agencies well represented because they all had a major role to play really in the implementation of this study. And that's one of the key things I want to point out. As a management district, we have many different goals and many different programs and services that we have to provide to our constituents. So it's not just infrastructure projects. We also provide beautification, general maintenance of public areas. We have public safety programs. We provide marketing for the area. And so we do have a limited funds. We have to make sure we meet all of our goals, not just infrastructure goals for the area. So one of the key things that we liked about our study was that the study outlined which stakeholder would be responsible for what project and who would take the leadership role on those projects. So we felt that was really important because the management district does have a lot of things that we have to focus on. We can't put all of our resources into one goal. So moving forward, these are the overall goals of our study, pretty wide ranging. So the first would be the local, regional, international hub of Houston. be a model for safe places to walk and bike, and that's what we're going to focus on today for this presentation. Be defined by a central park that holds floodwater and be a place that offers accessible, affordable housing for the region. So wide-ranging goals touching on a lot of different subjects. And we knew we'd have to have a strategy for each one of these. So focusing on the kind of the active transportation component, put these up just to show you kind of the scope of some of the recommendations. The first there, completing the Bayou Greenways program. So a lot of trail connectivity along Greens Bayou. We'd already started a lot of that work. The Parks Board had focused on some things, but lofty goal to complete that project. So that was one recommendation. Down below there, completing a sidewalk system. So looking at our existing sidewalk system, identifying some deficiencies of where we needed to focus some effort. So a lot of projects came out of that. And then also the last image there, a comprehensive bikeway plan that looks at sidewalks, looks at bikeways and how they tie into the overall trail system on Greens Bayou. So pretty large scope. We began to ask the questions of where do we begin? What can the district do to implement some of these improvements? Here's the overall cost estimates that initially came out of that Livable Center study. So for our sidewalk recommendations, about 6.3 million. For the Bayou Greenways, completing that project, about 1.2 million. And our bikeways, 18.9 million. So beyond our means from a financial standpoint, obviously we had to have good partners and a strategy moving forward. So one of the questions we asked, what should our funding strategy be? Obviously, look at the district funds, but also what's the best way to leverage those funds? What are some of the grants that we could go after? And we also asked the question, perhaps we should start partnering with some other consultants, some other groups, folks who have had experience and some level of expertise in moving projects like this forward. So that led to our first step in implementing some of the sidewalk recommendations that came out of this plan. We selected the sidewalks because there were some really obvious improvements that were needed there, some quick wins that we thought we could move forward with. And so we brought in an engineering firm, Gage Engineering, to conduct an assessment of some of the intersections and sidewalk recommendations that came out of that Livable Centers plan. And what we wanted was prioritization of those projects. And we wanted that study to tell us where we should start first. And they did that. So they prioritized a lot of those sidewalk recommendations according to these criteria that you see here: safe school access, transit access, Greens Bayou access, and then also, other challenges due to constraints, public right-of-way utilities, those types of things. So they drilled down a little bit deeper on the recommendations that came out of that study. Some other of the study goals, some initial coordination with the city and the county, because we had recommendations within both of those jurisdictions, just to make them aware of the things that we were looking at and identifying any potential hangups, problems, challenges. So it was good to start that process. We also put some thought into the development of some typical sections that we might want to employ as a part of this project. And then the very important opinion of probable construction costs. So if you recall the previous slide that had the image of all of the sidewalk improvements, once we went through this assessment with Gage, kind of narrowed down on some key corridors that we felt like the management district could advance. Major corridors throughout the area. And one of the corridors that we noticed that came to the forefront was Imperial Valley. That's what we really wanted to focus on moving forward. So we're talking about quick wins. We're talking about projects that the district can move forward pretty quickly. So the next step, we had that study. Next step, we began to prepare for grant opportunities. In this case, we brought in Urban Partnerships Community Development Corporation, UPCDC, to help us with that effort. We chose that group because the team there, led by Patrick Gazelle, had lots of experience implementing similar types of improvements in another management district, the East End District. So we wanted to tap into that knowledge base that he had put together and his team, and they began to work for us and taking a couple of different tracks. One, to identify some key projects, mobility projects that might be suitable for different types of funding. But also we wanted to utilize them to help us go after those grants, help us with grant applications and the management of those grants if we were awarded some funding. Two primary ways, tracks that we took that they're currently involved in working on right now. So we've just started this process. One is helping the management district obtain federal grantee status, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. But also getting us prepared for the upcoming call for projects. So for that, we obviously have to develop some specific projects for submittal for the TIP call for projects. Reason we wanted to go after federal grantee status, it just gives us a little more flexibility and control over grant funding if we are lucky enough to be awarded that. So in this case, if we are a designee, the funding comes directly to us, we execute the grant. It also gives us a little more control over all things design and construction. So it's a good process for us to go through. Some of those things that they're involved in helping us with is, you can see there, that last bullet, a lot of policies and some procedures that we will have to develop and be adopted by our board to be able to go after this federal grantee status. And we are in the process of doing that right now. We've just started this year on that. So the call for projects, livable center study, assessment plan, we're now drilling down into some very specific projects that we feel like we can submit for funding. Work with UPCDC and Traffic Engineers, Inc. They actually partner with UPCDC on kind of defining a scope and coming up with a very specific project. In this case, Imperial Valley Drive, I mentioned before. And we were looking at a very specific project that would tie in the trails on Greens Bayou, some of our parks, some schools that we have in the area, incorporating transit improvements, some other traffic improvements as a part of a project. And this is the project that we've developed and have defined. And wish I could point here on the map, but I can't. But you can see you have a spine tying into one of our major parks, Thomas Wiseau Park on Greens Road. We have some sidewalk improvements going up Imperial Valley up to Rankin Road. And within that corridor, there is a major school development. We also have what we're calling a side path. It's a 10-foot wide, almost an off-street trail system along that right of way that ties into our trail system at Wiseau Park, but also goes up to the schools, into the neighborhood, back down to another park facility that we have developed or going to develop. It's on the plans. So included in this, we have several different ped and bike crossing improvements, intersection improvements, and some signal improvements. So what all of this work led up to, and what we will be focusing on, are really, again, the key projects that we feel like we can take some ownership of and push forward in the short term, which is really what we're looking at. These are the different types of projects that our consultant team help us develop to submit a statement of project interest leading up to the call for projects. And you can see there the Imperial Valley improvements at 2.8 million. Some additional improvements they're tying into that, about 775,000 And then we have 2 different trail connectors as part of the Bayou Greenways initiative, 1.3 million, 390,000 that we feel like we can get done in the short term. So 2, 3, 4 years perhaps. And keep in mind, there are many different recommendations that came out of this livable center study. These are the things that we wanted to focus on from the short term. We are still actively involved in moving forward all of these other recommendations, all of the, the more the economic development, the housing, some of those other types of things as well, in addition to this. So hopefully this was helpful. We're just at the very beginning of this process. It gives you an idea of our strategy, how we started with a large group of recommendations and projects and tried to narrow them down to some things that we felt like we could handle. It was mentioned earlier, funding is limited, and so that's why we kind of took this approach. All right. Thank you.
So folks, Wendy's let me know that our heads are getting cut off virtually. So for the folks who are listening in, this is what we look like, the rest of our body. 1 second. Awesome. Well, I remember, Bart, when you called me and we were talking about, the plan is done and there is something called the federal grantee status. Is that something we should do? Yes, no, the cost associated with it are XYZ. And we talked about it, I remember. And what it came down to was really the idea of FTA funds, and that the ability to draw down those FTA funds was so enticing and so strong, and that you were able to then manage your design into construction, really became, I would say, the catalyst to moving forward with deciding to go for that federal grantee status. So for the folks listening on the phone, one question I would have to you is, are you eligible to become a federal grantee? What does that look like, right? So we know about the tip call for projects here at HGAC, but again, I think through this process, we're learning that we can diversify how we do our funding. I also think it's really interesting, Bart, that you started off with a sidewalk assessment and kind of spent your funds on that, and then realized, oh gosh, we ran out of money. And how are we going to now leverage this to bring more money in? So just things to think about. Folks, I'm going to introduce our next set of speakers, and then we'll take questions after. We're moving now into the city of Houston. As I mentioned, we've done multiple livable center studies there, but we're going to focus in on 2 areas that became complete communities and absorbed the livable center recommendations and have continued to progress. So I want to introduce 2 guys today. We're going to tag team this presentation. I have Donald Baku. He is an AICP associate member of the American Institute of Architects. He's a planner manager and the urban design lead, which I think is very exciting, in the multimodal safety and design branch of the TOD, or Transportation and Drainage Operations Service of Houston Public Works. So I was really excited to see Houston now has a design studio and that they're moving forward with the incubation of active transportation projects. He is co-presenting today with Malku Mohorta. He is an urban designer, and he develops innovative and equitable solutions for the new American city. He is a principal and director at MIG, and he has award-winning designs that have been creating thriving downtowns and historic districts, as well as these new livable communities we've been talking about. So with that, I'm going to hand the floor over to our 2 presenters.
All right, thank you, Anita. Someone asked me, do I ever take my hat off? And I do it for friends. So AGSC and Anita, you are privileged. I took my hat off for you. Thank you for having me today. This is great. We're gonna be talking about the Houston Resilient Sidewalks. How many of you here have heard about it in the room? If you've heard about the Resilient Sidewalks plan that the city is doing. All right, I see a few hands. So sometimes we call it the Resilient Sidewalks Plan. Sometimes we call it the Houston Resilient Plan Study. There are so many names out there. But with that, I'll just give you a little bit of description of what we are doing. And just as Bart mentioned, there's been a lot of studies out there. We have the Livable Center study for Kashmir Gardens. We have the Kashmir Gardens Complete Community Study. And even the city of Houston, we have a Resilient Houston that we are using as our North Star for a lot of the things that we are doing. You would see so many studies that have been done. And all of these, I would say there was some momentum that had been created, both citywide as well as for the communities that had been focused into. But again, as we've been hearing, we have a lot of these studies, we have a lot of these plans, but we always come to the point where how do we move them forward? So as you all know, in 2017, Hurricane Harvey came through and it devastated our region. It wasn't a good thing that happened, but based on that, one little silver lining, if any, was that the city received CDBG DR funding, DR17, disaster recovery funding, to do some planning studies and also some modeling efforts and a few other planning level initiatives. Now, one of these was the Resilient Sidewalks study out of the 6 resilience planning studies, and that is what we'll be talking about today. So what it is that it's a study that was actually focused on, it has 3 prongs to it. There is a citywide toolkit component, and then zooming into 2 complete communities, one being Kashmir Gardens and the other one being Galveston. Now, these 2 communities were selected because they were both very badly inundated in Harvey, but then the difference between them is that Kashmir Gardens is mostly open ditch drainage system, and Galveston is more of curb and gutter. So the study was looking at how these 2 drainage situations can be studied, how can they be mitigated in terms of resiliency. And then the citywide toolkit was going to build off of whatever we learned from those 2 communities to see if we could create a toolkit which could be applicable to several neighborhoods and communities around. So the main focus of the study was to look at safety for mobility, also to look at drainage, accessibility, alternative materials, innovative design. I mean, everything you can think of, all the aspirational. And then funding was a big one as well. And that's why it's been bolded. And that's why we are here today. As we started off, we're all excited. If we're in church, you'll be saying hallelujahs and people responding amens. But we got to the point where we realized that funding always becomes a bottleneck. So we are currently still in the process of it. Again, to reemphasize, it's a planning level study. We are examining sidewalks for mobility and drainage. The way I like to put it is sidewalks perform both in the horizontal and in the vertical. If sidewalks are performing as they should, the horizontal providing access, safe ADA mobility, and in the vertical ensuring that it is contributing positively, if it can, to the drainage infrastructure. So it can't do everything in big events like Harvey, but the day-to-day events, how much can the sidewalks help mitigate some of the drainage and flooding issues that we have? So the aim of the project is also to create a menu of options for the typical community, typical corridor, typical right-of-way section. What can we do in terms of, and Mukul will tell you a little bit more about that. What can we do in terms of drainage? What are the options for the sidewalk surface itself? What can we do when we get into a typical place? And I would say that this project was housed in Houston Public Works because we wanted it to be pragmatic and practical. It's being led by 3 departments in the city, the mayor's office providing the umbrella, and then Public Works, me being the PM, and then having housing, administering, making sure we are compliant with the GLO, where we receive the funding from through the CDBGDR. But the big thing is that as we started right into it, we realized that even though we are talking about this as a resilient sidewalks project, we were rather looking more at a resilient pedestrian network, because you can have a sidewalk that is functioning, but when you get somewhere, there's no sidewalk. How do you ensure that people are still connected? So we think it is bigger than a sidewalk, it is rather a pedestrian network. So with that, just a little bit about where we are. It's an 18-month-long study. We started in the fall of last year, just about this time, and we are hoping to wrap up at the end of this year or very early next year. So we did all the typical things that we'll do. Like I said, we were all excited. We were going to bring all the innovation that we could think of, looking at precedents from all around the country, around the world, and all that. So we looked at mobility framework, we looked at resiliency, green stormwater infrastructure, looking at all the examples. Our consulting team has been doing amazing, coming up with a lot of ideas. We are always working with our internal city team, as well as some of the partner agencies, trying to come up with all the ideas on constructability and all that. And then just when we are about to wrap up, again, this is why we do studies, we are realizing that it's bigger than just the ideas. We are getting stuck at funding. And that is why when Anita called on us, we said, you know what, we are about the right time to discuss this. So with that, I believe I'll have Muku come up and tell us some of the things we are doing in terms of innovation and all that. And then we go into the funding side of things. So Muku.
Thanks, Donald. I think the advantage of being short is that your head doesn't get cut off in the camera. So you will see my full face, which is fortunate and unfortunate for some. But as Bart and Monisha and others have talked about, it all starts with a strong foundation of technical analysis. And that's what our team did in terms of understanding where the flooding occurs, where are the drainage issues, where the high injury network, the vision zero, and where are the missing sidewalks, honestly. And I do want to point out, MIT is leading this effort, but we have great local partners, including Connect Community, NHRC, as well as CGS Bailey and Design Jones. And helping all of that happen is, as we have talked about, is community involvement. You would think talking about sidewalks, types of drainage solutions. It's a very technical issue. A lot of us would be hard pressed in this room to be able to identify what are the best solutions. So it was very important that we work with the community and just between the two neighborhoods, inform them, educate them, for them to make informed decisions, as opposed to consultants making all the decisions. And it's been a pretty successful effort with over 800 responses at different milestones of the project. As Donald was talking about, it is a complex study, just looking at one condition, which is an open ditch, and within the open ditch, for a local residential streets. So here are 7 different conditions that exist for just one criteria that we have to keep in mind. And then we have to look at other conditions of curb and gutter, or just curb, or if the ditch is next to the property line, so on and so forth. So it's not a one size fits all. That adds to the technical rigor of the project. And we have to keep in mind, can we achieve everything all at once? Can we build sidewalks on both sides of the street? Or should we look at, for example, of options at just one side of the street? And then as funding becomes available, look at both sides of the street. On the right, what you're seeing is Kashmir Gardens. And that what we are proposing is just this one solution that is applicable to different streets within Kashmir Gardens. Please keep in mind, 80% of the neighborhood has no sidewalks, and they have never had those sidewalks. It's unbelievable that we are still living in an age that so many neighborhoods have no sidewalks. And so with that in mind, and keeping in mind that I think what Anita and others have pointed out, that we'll never have money. I think the critical thing is to start looking at very strategic solutions, both short term as well as long term, that would work for different types of conditions, so that we start to meet some very basic, I would say, human needs that every neighborhood and every citizen should have. And it starts with prioritization and phasing, and Donald's going to talk more about it.
All right, thank you, Mukul. And forgive us if it seems we are running a bit, but we would have time for Q&A, so you can jot down your notes. So like we've been hearing, there isn't money, or if even there is, it's not enough. So for what we are doing, like Mukul just mentioned, there are times when we have the vision to do something really good for the community, or that actually checks all the boxes, but we never have enough money. So for this project, and as we say, we are just about 4 months out, we think we are going to develop a very robust prioritization matrix. And the way we are thinking of using this is to work with the community to kind of assess the areas that make the most impact, or the corridors that make the most impact, and kind of pair it against what the greater implementation barriers or costs will be. So that we find the sweet spot where we have the highest impact or benefit versus the lowest barriers or cost to it. And if possible, we can have near-term solutions, which will provide safe, ADA accessible solutions as part of the resilient pedestrian network that I earlier alluded to. And then if possible, build on those for longer term CIP projects, maybe full reconstruction projects, when the funding becomes available. Because what we believe is that sometimes we are thinking of the pie in the sky scenario, and the short-term need is never achieved for those who really need it. So rather, why don't we think of a way to get it done somewhat, to at least ensure that people are safe, walking safely, and have access to places they want to go to. So there is some available local funding. The city has some programs. One of them is the sidewalk program that we have, which offers 3 different funding sub-programs. We have the pedestrian accessibility review program, and we can send you links to that later on. We also have the school sidewalk program in place, and then the major thoroughfare program. These are all programs that exist that community members are able to apply to get some, especially in neighborhoods, some sidewalks, several linear feet of sidewalks. We also have the council district service fund that is available, where there is discretionary use of that funding sometimes for sidewalks. And then the Complete Communities Improvement Fund from the mayor's office as well also provides some funding. We have some regional funding opportunities as well. You can see it on your list. I don't want to read through all of them, but I think the big picture is that some of these funding opportunities are available currently, but then we still realize that it's still not enough. And we put this 3-legged stool here because in as much as we are going in, like I said, thinking about resiliency, which is now the buzzword, quickly kicking out sustainability in the last 5 years, everybody is talking about it. But for us, what we are realizing is that resiliency is funding first. We can talk about all the ideas for mobility and drainage, but without the funding leg, this tool is not going to stand. So whilst we are going to do a toolkit that would produce an actionable plan, we are very confident we can do that. Without funding, implementation may not be likely. And we are seeing several barriers and bottlenecks, and neighborhood scale funding especially is lacking. So this is a term that I've come up with for this project. We've been toying it around, which we are saying funding deserts. What happens is that the programs that I mentioned and other opportunities that have that arise for several neighborhoods, if you were to draw circles on them, you would realize that there are still some communities that never have funding for their sidewalks. These communities are in deserts. They are funding deserts, like we have food deserts. So how can these communities ever have their sidewalks funded? Because as you know, in the city, new development encourages, or new development requires new sidewalks to be installed. But in communities where there isn't probably potential for any new development, they are probably not going to get any new sidewalks. and also existing sidewalks that are in a dilapidated state also is supposed to be taken care of by the adjacent homeowner. And we are talking about communities where equitably they can't do it. So this creates a desert, and those deserts, we have to find some funding for them. So what do we do? What will be the actionable next steps such that all these ideas even make sense, and then these deserts can be watered a little bit? So when we wrap up this plan, again, like I said, it's housed in Houston Public Works. So it's going to be something that can be referenced to the Infrastructure Design Manual, IDM. So it becomes a working document. As we all know here, preaching to the choir here, we don't want it to be, again, a plan on the shelves. We want it to be something that is actionable. We want it to be something that is meaningful. So creating a real working document, the way I describe it is we can actually pull out pages, insert pages, and then also have a menu of options. When we go into a typical corridor or right-of-way section, whoever it is, whoever the audience is, either a community member, city staff, developer, what are the options for creating something there that you can pick from in terms of resiliency and mobility? What are the drainage options that you can use for that particular right-of-way, 60 feet? What are the options we have? And then also we have an upcoming sidewalk inventory. Typically, we've been having sidewalk inventories in the city. It's been, I would say, for me, I'll say it's mechanical because we use equipment that takes the pavement condition index of pavement. And then I think these lasers are able to get the condition of sidewalks as well. I'm pushing that for the next round. We add some qualitative data to it. So we actually get some more information on sidewalks, how it pertains to the community, how it bleeds into the community, and how they use it. And then also to identify, based on that, I think that would even help us to see where the deserts are. So using the conditions and then overlaying it with some work, looking at where funding is available versus where funding isn't, so that when we have the menu of options, we look at places that are lacking funding at the same time. And then identify grant funding and partnerships to fund all these. There's hope on the horizon. I don't know if you all have heard about the sidewalk fee in lieu that the city is putting together. It's currently going through the process, and I believe will be an agenda item for council very soon. But what it is that a fee is going to be levied on developers who are not able to put in a sidewalk. If you're not able to put in a sidewalk, you'll be asked to pay a fee. And then this fee is going to be put into a bucket. The city has been divided into several districts based on this. And then 70% of that funding will be used to improve sidewalks in that district, and the rest of the 30% spread around the city. Again, there may be still some deserts because that 30% may not be enough, but at least it's a start. And these are some of the innovative things that we think would help. And then we can also target all the grants that are on the horizon. And thank you for giving us that list. I think there's so much out there. We will have to take advantage of it. And then I would invite Mukul back up. I believe there are other strategies out there that we can explore. So, Mukul.
Thanks, Donald. As you can see, the city of Houston is trying so hard. We have a rich, diverse palette of funding opportunities, but like we all have discussed, it's not enough. We have to start thinking out of the box if we really, really need to come up with a viable, implementable plan of really building sidewalks in all our neighborhoods, in all our communities, with no exceptions. So I'm going to just share a few examples of what have other cities done around the world. MIT's got an opportunity to work in different parts of the country. A great program that the city of Ann Arbor has, for example, it's a city of about 120,000 people. About 10, 12 years ago, they started with a sidewalk millage tax that was approved by the people. It was approved for about $500,000, and it actually helps assess about $13 per household. That's something that you begin to spread the pain. But what it starts to do in a city which has about 450 miles of sidewalks, but a gap of 150 miles, of sidewalk, which in turn would take about 150 to 220 million dollars to build. 10 years ago, they started with $500,000 each year. They recently passed a continuation of this mileage tax in 2020 that increases to $1.3 million. But it starts to make a difference. They are committed to fulfilling all the gaps in all the neighborhoods with no exceptions. Another city like Cheney, Washington, it's only 12,000 people. And they went ahead with the 4% utility tax on their electric and natural gas. Again, it is helping the community generate about $380,000 a year to do the sidewalk repair and replacement, which helps. And some things work, some things don't. Some cities are very powerful and have the economic capital like Seattle and maybe even Fort Worth. They try different ideas. Sometimes they don't work. Some cities have the advantage of having statewide tools. It could be the highway tax, the in lieu fees, so on and so forth. But I do want to talk very briefly about things that are controlled within a city to actually help implement. So the first one is the bond measure. I'm sure you have heard of many cities such as Austin or San Antonio or even smaller cities like Corpus Christi have gone and said a few decades ago that they have to start thinking big. The city of San Antonio, this is the case study I'm showing to you, about 2007, started with their bond measure. It was about $550 million. Recently, we just passed a bond measure of $1.2 million. So what you all see in the blue and the reds are all kind of improvements that are happening or have just happened in the last few years. It makes an incredible difference in improving the overall, not just sidewalk safety, but also quality of life. And it starts with big projects to simple crosswalks to 100 feet, 20 feet of sidewalk repair. The city is addressing it at multiple levels. The other way to look at it is maybe a bond measure honestly takes 3, 4, sometimes more years to make it happen. What can you do now? One of the great examples is the city of Austin's neighborhood partnering program, where they work with neighborhood groups. They have different categories, a small project less than 150,000, or maybe another category of 150 to 500, where the city partners with neighborhood groups, and the community or the neighborhood groups provide either the materials, the sweat equity, all helping build important amenities from sidewalks to connection to parks, schools, so on and so forth. And other cities have also done it very successfully. There's also cities, a number of cities, for example, in California, which not only help work with the neighborhood groups, but it's also the long-term maintenance where they are saying, let the neighborhood groups actually help maintain the sidewalk as opposed to making it the responsibility of the city or the individual property owners fronting onto the sidewalk to maintain it. And then last but not the least, I think we have briefly talked about federal funding, but I do want to be politically incorrect by stating the key thing to keep in mind that all of this involves politics. Politics is the #1 issue. We may have the most rigorous technical analysis and it will still fail if it doesn't have the political power behind it. This particular case, also working, we have raise grants, federal grants, which build on past Tiger grant funding that has happened. In this particular case that I'm sharing with you, it's in the city of Mobile, Alabama, an incredibly divided city. But the aim was to look at it in 2 strategic ways, as opposed to saying which sidewalk is most needed. The city went on saying and took a very realistic route and said, which will have the most political backing, #1. And the other criteria was which would fit the grant funding requirement, as opposed to the other way around, where you look at the most important streets. There was a very honest assessment done. Let's be the grant friendly applicant, and then second of all, have the maximum political backing across the entire political spectrum. So with that, we would love to take questions.
All right, I'm going to open the floor to questions. I will say what I enjoyed the most listening to the city of Houston was talking about the idea that grants are important, but also internalizing what you can do as a municipality to leverage the way you fund projects. I found very interesting. I love the term funding desert. I was telling Donald it might be something we need to coin and talk about and start to think about how do you address the issue of funding deserts. I think we understand if you don't have a management district or a TERS, how do you start quickly bringing those funds in? And then I also like the idea that you can think about your infrastructure design manual. Some communities have them, some communities don't know you should have one. And how that can influence just every single time you touch a project, you're also touching the design and the considerations associated with that project. The other one I just wanted to highlight for discussion was the fee in lieu that the city of Houston is moving forward with. That does start to, again, diversify your funding pot as you start to think about different ways to fund these types of programs. And then the neighborhood program. The idea that sidewalks ultimately are maintained by the adjacent property owner, but as a community, what can you do to help your neighbor where you don't put the onus necessarily on just an individual, but you're actually doing it as a community. Now, I don't want to set the stage for the first question, but does anybody want to ask a question? I just wanted to highlight the things that jumped out to me. Jeff.
Thanks everyone for your presentations. I think what's really great to see all the funding that's becoming available for sort of the hardscape improvements. One of the things I'd be curious is how you're thinking about things that will require ongoing maintenance that are often what makes a great sidewalk. So I'm thinking about lighting, particularly pedestrian scale lighting, trees and watering and maintenance, and where the funding comes for those, because so many projects you can build a great sidewalk, but if it's not maintained or in a great experience, people don't get it full use of it.
So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our speakers. Donald, do you want to address to start?
Thank you, Jeff. Good to see you. Yes, so I think that's something that we are thinking about. So what we are doing is as part of this toolkit, we're actually creating what we call project cut sheets. So kind of like you have a cut sheet for a product, we'll have a cut sheet for a typical right of way, where we would take, like for instance, back of curb, what are the options? If it's lighting, if it's utility boxes, if it's even pedestrian amenities. Now, within that particular corridor, who would be in charge of funding it, or who would champion its funding? After that, who maintains it? Which is really critical, especially when we are talking about some of these innovative strategies. I think yesterday Mukul and I were talking, and I was saying, so when we talk about these LID infrastructure, how can the typical community maintain it? Is the city going to buy new equipment to make sure that we are helping out to maintain places where, I mean, even as we have open ditches now, it's hard to maintain. And now we are going to put in specialized vegetation and all that. So I think those are things that we are hoping out of this study, we will start addressing, because a lot of times it gets glossed over. We put in all the fancy stuff, but who is going to maintain it? And that is where we get to the point of funding, maintenance, community champions, all that. So I think what we are going to do is, at the end of this document, we are not hoping, even if it doesn't look good, but it's meaningful. That's what we would prefer. If it's a series of tables, it's a series of hyperlinks, it's a series of spreadsheets, I think that will be more meaningful, such that when anybody picks up one cut sheet, they know what to do, at least to a point. I hope that answers your question. And I don't know if Mukul wants to add anything to it.
I think I agree with what you're asking for in the case of the Gulfton neighborhood. The number one amenity that the community said they want to see in their walking environment was trees. It was more important to them to have trees because then sidewalks, just because it's one of the hottest neighborhoods, if not just in Texas, but the entire country. I guess what I'm also saying is, I think we are thinking a lot. Well, number one, we have put the onus, and this is not just the case of Houston, but most cities in America, we have put the onus on the property owner to develop or maintain the sidewalks and the adjoining landscape. Is it really feasible that they'll do it? We have put it on a piece of paper, but it's not a viable strategy for most neighborhoods, especially who are in households where people work 2 jobs a day. It's just not feasible. So the alternative strategy to start thinking about, like I tried to show with the neighborhood partnering program, or in the case of city of Richmond, where the city is saying, we will never have enough staff to maintain all the sidewalks and all the planting areas. Why don't we try to invest in neighborhood groups, develop their ability to maintain and be realistic that a city will never have enough staff to maintain the sidewalks and the planting areas. And therein, the city is actually giving money to the neighborhood groups, which is helping create living wage jobs. It's a different model of looking at our sidewalks and our public infrastructure. And what is the city's responsibility? To pave, repave, repave, repave the roadway. That's good enough. But the rest of the stuff, where they have already given the responsibility to the adjoining property owners, let's start to look at alternative models to help truly maintain these sidewalks and landscape areas.
Thank you for that. We have one more question. Go ahead.
Thank you, everyone, for your comments, your presentations. I see in all the presentations we've seen so far, good renderings, talking about sidewalk programs, talking about bike facilities, and they're all showing the parallel lines along the roadway. How do we get across? Donald, that'll be for you. How do we get across?
So that's a good question. And I think Mukul, when we started, we mentioned the high injury network. So as we are doing this, we are looking at Vision Zero, we are looking at high injury network and crossing intersections as well as mid-block. So for instance, we've been talking about phasing, where we are saying if we don't have enough funding, we'll probably start a sidewalk on one side. But then at that point, we have to see what our IDM would allow. That's an infrastructure design manual. If you are if you are providing ADA accessible sidewalks, what about the people on the other side of the roadway who don't have that access? So at that point, what kind of crossing can we provide? Are we going to start providing just painted crosswalks? Are we going to provide raised crosswalks or something like that? Do we reference back to the IDM and say that, you know what, since there will be near-term solutions, probably we have to allow for this to happen safely. And then who then takes the responsibility with any incident that happens at the crosswalk? So again, like we said, we are looking at this bigger than just sidewalks. That's why now we are going more comprehensive, zooming out and saying it's more of a resilient pedestrian network. So crosswalks, and even outside of the road corridor, looking at alleys, looking at trail systems, looking at private connections through private development, they all contribute to getting people from one point to the other. And then places where if even the roadway becomes impossible, almost impossible to put people there, what are the other alternative routes that will get people around? So in as much as we are looking at this, or we went into this looking at crosswalks parallel to corridors, I think you are very right. We would not ignore sidewalks, will not ignore crosswalks as well. And then back to something that Mukul mentioned, we're also looking at shade network. I think that is kind of alluding to what Jeff talked about, because nobody would like to walk in 100 degrees, even on the best sidewalk infrastructure. So what kind of shade network can we start creating as part of mitigating the effect of some of these heat islands, these linear heat islands? So are shade networks only trees, or do we have cooling stations in neighborhoods? How can we use probably regional detention facilities as part of these cooling centers, where maybe every 5-10 minutes walk, somebody will get an opportunity to cool off or something like that? So I think it all contributes to thinking about this a little more holistically, rather than just a typical sidewalk. Crossings, alternative routes, shading, lighting, other infrastructure and pedestrian amenities. I hope I answered your question a bit. Mostly. We are still on the project. We'll take all your comments. We have 4 months to go. I think we'll take all the thoughts and comments and try to include them as we go forward. Thank you.
Mhm.
All right.
Thank you for the question. I believe really quickly, we have one online question. I think we have time for one more question. And Chad, we can get to you during the break.
This question is from Paul Chavez. Where can cities look for maintenance funding for sidewalks beyond installation funding?
For our speakers, the question was, where can cities look for maintenance funds for sidewalks? And then also implementation funds. I know we talked about it a little bit. Bart, I know that with the management district, there's a lot of questions around maintenance. Do you want to address it first, and then we can move to our other speakers?
Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm not sure about cities. For management districts, that's a big part of what we do. I mean, a lot of the improvements, enhanced improvements that are made either by the city or other entities within our area, those entities look to the district to actually maintain those enhancements. So that was a comment actually I was thinking of when we were talking about, well, how are all of these sidewalks going to be maintained? You know, I think a good example is the Metro Boost program, where Metro's looking at enhanced bus shelters on certain routes. I mean, they were very proactive in coming to the management district saying, look, we're going to make a bunch of improvements here. There are opportunities for partnership here, for enhancements, for landscaping, for beautification, for branding, for public art. But we need that partner to be able to come in and maintain those types of things. Metro cannot do that. And so we're actively involved in that design process right now with them. So districts have a source of funds for those types of things. And I think I would imagine a lot of the improvements that we are looking at implementing in our area, we will have a hand in maintaining some of those. The problem is management districts don't cover every area within the city of Houston. So
Yeah, and Bart, that was sort of a trick question asking you first, because it's interesting that in the state of Texas, we have certain tools that other states don't have. And one is a management district. And as a local municipality, you can elect to champion for a management district. And they do have funds that allow for that maintenance part. And of course, in our other presentation, we heard about different ways we can think about maintenance so that the onus is not just on the city or the management district, but we start thinking about the community. Donald Makul, did you want to add anything to that?
Oh, yeah. So I just wanted to add that some of the programs that we've started, like the fee in lieu, I believe something like that can help. I know that for now it's still being scoped out. So it could be for new installations, but if the program gets well established and there is more funding, I'm sure there can be a percentage that can be dedicated to maintenance as well. So that's a pilot that I think if it really gets traction, could be one source, at least for now. So.
Anything addition?
No, I would just. I would just add to what Donald just said. He presented a menu of options. It's not just for building new sidewalks, but it also helps make sure if sidewalks get upheaved, they get cracked, that's part of the sidewalk gap maintenance program. So it applies to both new construction as well as maintaining any sidewalks which are deficient right now.
Well, I just want to thank our morning speakers. We are now at break time. It is 9:45, but I love ending on the maintenance question. One thing as we think about bringing down funds and finding the money is typically those funds don't necessarily cover maintenance. And that can be something we need to think about on the back end. So we thought, Manisha did a great job helping us think about those barriers we run into right of way, environmental clearance, things that we don't think about on the front end. But we also have to think about the back end as well. So that's a great question to end it on. And we're going to then move to our HGAC staff experts with the resources you can use tomorrow, leaving here, I'm sorry, Monday, because tomorrow's the weekend. So we'll see everybody back here promptly at 11. Thanks, everyone.
Great slide.
All right, folks, it is 11 a.m. I'm going to ask those in the room to start taking a seat. So if I had a glass, I would be dinging it right about now. Ding, 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 ding. Hi, everyone. So I hope everyone was able to grab a snack. The Milano cookies are a personal favorite. Get your chocolate fix in. So guys, we're going to open up the second half of the workshop, and it's really to start diving into, we've talked about finding the money. And the truth is that we have some programs and resources here at HGAC we really want to make sure folks are aware of and are taking advantage of. Our next speaker is really going to open up the platform for us to dive into this topic. I'd like to introduce Adam Beckham. He joined the Houston-Galveston Area Council in May of 2018, and he manages the development of the Transportation Improvement Program, so the TIP, which I know we're all interested in, the project selection process, as well as the environmental justice Title VI planning efforts. And with that, if you'll help me welcome Adam to the podium.
All right, good morning, everyone. So as Anita mentioned, my name is Adam Beckham. I manage the project programming and delivery group here at the Houston-Galveston Area Council. That includes, as she mentioned, development of the Transportation Improvement Program, which is our 4-year funding document, as well as the project selection process, which prioritizes projects for funding and implementation across the region. So when we think of mobility funding, the first thing we think about is a project. However, and this can include, various types of active transportation infrastructure projects, including sidewalks, bicycle facilities, or enhanced bus stops. However, where a project should be programmed or further prioritized is assisted by our HGAC planning and programming efforts. Planning and programs. Additionally, you want to make sure that your project is listed or aligns with the HGAC 20-year regional transportation plan. Currently, right now, we're in the 2045 RTP and working on the update to the 2045 RTP for later next year. And this helps to align your project with various funding sources, including the Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Program, which focuses on projects that provide an air quality benefit, our Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, which is a general mobility program, our Transportation Alternative Set-Aside Program, which includes our Safe Routes to School project selection efforts, as well as projects that fund smaller sidewalks or bicycle pedestrian type facility projects. And also it helps to align your project with discretionary grant opportunities such as the RAISE or the BUILD grants. So just to give some perspective on the relationship between our short-term and long-term planning and programming efforts, the Transportation Improvement Program, which is a 4-year state and federally mandated document that prioritizes our projects across all modes. So that includes highway projects, sidewalk projects, bicycle pedestrian projects, as well as other active transportation projects and programs. Currently, right now, we are in the 2023 to 2026 Transportation Improvement Program, or TIP. And then as you look further out, HJC is required to develop a 10-year plan. So this is a fiscally constrained plan of projects set for implementation over the next 10 years. And we try to align this with the TxDOT's 10-year planning effort, which is done under their Unified Transportation Program. And as you go further out in time, 20 plus years, you get to our Regional Transportation Plan. And then even further out from that, the state develops a statewide long-range transportation plan, which is 24 years or more. So the Transportation Improvement Program, we develop it once every 18 months, it feels like, and we modify it on a monthly basis. So every month, as soon as we develop it, it's already out of date because projects are changing very rapidly. So as soon as we get that document approved, it's already out of date in some instances. And so you'll see monthly amendments to the TIP document as well as our regional transportation plan. The HJC Transportation Policy Council oversees the development of the Transportation Improvement Program and also monitors projects for implementation. So once a project is selected by the TPC for funding, we monitor that project until completion or open to traffic of the project. And that's very important because we want to make sure that our federal funds are put to the highest and best use. And also our federal funds have expiration dates. So we want to make sure that those funds don't expire, which reduces the amount of funding available to the region. So as we think about projects, we have a few questions that you want to think about. So first, is this a transportation-based project? Are we fulfilling a transportation need primarily with this project? This can include projects that offer bikeways, pedestrian walkways, bridges, and even highway projects that utilize federal funding. And then has your project completed its environmental assessment? So where is it in the environmental process? There was talk earlier about the categorical exclusion process, and then moving on up further in complexity, the environmental assessment, as well as an EIS process, which those processes take time. And so this question also kind of gets at, how ready is your project for federal funding? And then moving on to another somewhat of a readiness question, is your project designed or engineered? When applying for TIP funds, you can apply through HJC, apply to receive design or engineering funds. However, it's important to know that effort takes time. It has to be done to federal standards. So it adds more time to your project. So if that's something you're looking for, that's something you have to take into account. So those projects may not be able to be completed in the next 5 years. They may span that 5 to 10 year time frame. And then number 4, does the location of your project qualify for federal funding? So this question has a lot of layers to it. As you think about, we are in the Houston-Galveston metropolitan planning area. So that limits a lot of our federal funding to the 8-county region. So that's Harris County and the surrounding counties immediately adjacent to the county. And then also we want to make sure that your project is listed on the Texas statewide system and also looking at the federal functional class. So depending on the type of project that you are trying to implement, it must meet those minimum standards of being a major collector or above, if it's in an urban area, in order to receive those federal funds. And then also we want to make sure that like as I said, your project is, I may have mentioned this, your project is listed on that Texas statewide map, which is linked there. I had that noted twice in my notes because that's important. You want to make sure that it is listed there. And so what does this prep you for? And so, well, it helps to determine a track or a strategy for your project, whether that be additional planning work through one of HJC's planning efforts, like livable centers, as well as our sub-regional mobility plans, or even our active transportation efforts. It helps to align you to one of those plans, or it may better fit in one of HJC's ongoing programs, such as our Connect Smart Commute Solutions, our mobility counter programs, or maybe even our commuter and transit pilot program. I think that's it. I'll turn it over to Anita.
And guys, the 4 questions that Adam presented you today, that is part of your handouts. And Adam and I got together after we sat down on a few projects that were submitted from livable center studies. And it occurred to us that an initial self-screening should be done. For example, one of the recommendations we were looking at was not on the statewide system, and it was a built road, and it was a local road. And so because of that, you know, that should have been one that we should have probably pre-screened before it got into the HGAC sort of set of database to go through. So we started to realize that our local sponsors might need a little bit more direction. And so that's where these 4 questions came from. But as Adam mentioned, we do have lots of programs here, and I'm very excited to talk about safety. And today we have David Fink, who's joining us. He actually started with HGAC in 2017. And prior to that, he was with TxDOT for almost 30 years. He's responsible for the maintenance, operations, safety, hurricane evacuation planning, and preparedness for our region. And so very excited to hear from him today. So please help me welcome David.
Good morning. I guess I got my head cut off. No, I'm here. Hello, I'm David Fink. I'm program manager besides safety and hurricane evacuation. I also run the tow and go program. So if you're traveling on the freeway, remember tow and go website so we could get you off that freeway safe. You would break down with a flat tire or have car trouble. Make sure you put gas in your vehicle. That's one of our #1 issues out here. Anyway, HGAC adopted a regional safety plan in 2018, and it focused on these 5 areas here: impaired driving, distracted driving, speeding, intersection safety audits, what we're talking about here, and bicycle and pedestrian safety. So one of the things we do out here is we do a digital we do a regional safety campaign, which was identified in the plan, which just goes out and tries to remind people to put that phone down and pay attention in case you do not have those sidewalks out there, which is very important. We also have teens in the driver's seat program where we have a mentor program where teens talk amongst themselves about driving safely out there. I was just in a webinar earlier in the week where they were talking about distracted driving, where a gentleman's son was killed because of a distracted driver and stuff like that. So it's very important out there. And so this is something that we fund through that block grant funds that we get each year. The other one is child safety, where we teach them on how to use proper helmet use, how to ride a bicycle. We also do car seats out there, so how to install a car seat correctly. I think 71% of the car seats out there are installed incorrectly in a vehicle. So that's something that we also concentrate on. But let's get to where we're talking about today is intersection safety audits. Basically, when the study was done or the plan was done, they ran the numbers, and 40% of the crashes out there are involved at intersections. 25% of those crashes at those intersections are fatalities. And this was done back in 2018. Unfortunately, 2021 statistics didn't change much. 26% of the fatalities are still occurring at intersections, and 39% of those crashes are intersection related out there on our network. This crash, unfortunately, is a young man lost his life. This involved a DWI. This was the one down in Galveston. So intersections are something that we went and looked at in the region, in the 8-county region. We identified 51 based on crashes. We also looked at a number of fatalities and serious injuries out there. Like I said, initial list came up of 51. We talked with each county, our city, and had them identify other ones. So some of the ones that we identified, they've had already addressed the safety issues and had concerns with other ones. So in all, we just completed 58 intersection safety assessments out there. And this is a map of the region and where those locations were. And a lot of these regions are more rural regions that are experiencing a lot of growth, and they're trying to catch up with that deal. So this is a typical intersection safety audit. This is a rural section. This identified improvements that could be made, like rumble strips, stop signs, improving the turning radiuses, trimming trees, and other things. So there are anything from maintenance items to items that need to be funded through other types of programs. And some of those programs, and here's what we give it at the deal. We do an intersection safety assessment report. We came up with an executive summary. We had a benefit cost analysis. Peyton, what was some of the highest benefit cost numbers?
Mainly on very low cost, like strips or stop sign, quick flashing, things like that can reduce the likelihood.
Peyton, turn your microphone off.
You'd asked about the higher BCA scores, and on low cost improvements that are only a few $1,000s, you can reduce the likelihood of a fatality, which is valued at 4.5 million. So if you reduce the likelihood of a fatality by 10%, then that's a benefit over the next 20 years of a very high number. So you can get really high benefit to cost ratios.
So we did a field review of all the intersections out there. We met with local government staff to do these and review that and stuff like that. So a very good program. And we actually identified a lot of people did not know of certain funding mechanisms that could be used to improve these safety assessments out there. So here are some of the funding sources. HGAC TIP program, which Adam talked about earlier, developer fund improvement projects, which was discussed. As far as DWI, speeding, distracted driving, and seatbelt usage is the TxDOT Selective Traffic Enforcement Program known as STEP. The one that could be used and funding can cover anywhere from 80% of the project cost to 100% of the project cost. Our TxDOT Highway Safety Improvement Program. So that's out there. And then we had the federal grants that Anita will talk about later on, are the Safe Streets for All, known as SS4A. And the other one is Reconnecting Communities Pilot Project Program. So getting prepped for that. So what are we doing now? We had identified a safety task force. This safety task force is going to examine safety problems and solutions likely to work, identify new and comprehensive approaches to these transportation safety things. But the other thing is we're looking for is to develop performance measures and targets. We have those now, but do we need to add other performance measures and targets? An example of this is maybe DWI. How many DWI tickets are being issued out there, and then how many are being convicted? The other thing we need to look at is seatbelt usage. Seatbelt usage in Texas used to be around 95%. It's dropped below 90% now. And I think statewide, I believe 40% of the fatalities could have been prevented if people had seatbelts on. So that's an easy solution that for some reason we took a step back in the state. So we're going to look at state safe systems approach and maybe look at some new and aggressive strategies. What are these strategies? I don't know, but it may be the sidewalk issue, it may be other things. And then look at a dedicated transportation safety funding program. How much that's going to be, we don't know. That's what this task force is for. Is it going to be similar to the TxDOT Highway Safety Improvement Program, where it doesn't cover what doesn't get covered by that could be picked up by this? So that's something we would look at. And then we have the surface block grant funds that we use that does the road safety audits. In the past, this was done for the intersection safety. What we're looking at is maybe doing a roadway this time, but also I don't want to give you the fish. I want to teach you to fish. So we were looking at adding training on there. We do have some funds left over in our current project, and we're looking at amending that and maybe adding that component to it. We'll continue our driver's education through teens in the driver's seat, but maybe we need to have an adult driver education too. How do you deal with a bicyclist on a roadway? Or how do you deal with a pedestrian on a roadway? A lot of that. Distracted driving, a big thing. Continue our bicycle safety for youth and for adults. Do our transportation safety campaign to make you aware of these things. And like I said, continue our adult bicycle training. So let me look at what the screen is covering up over here. Anyway, this is talking about Safe Streets for All. It was announced in May of 2020. It's a 5-year funding. The first year of the grant proposals were due yesterday. HGAC submitted a proposal. The cost is $1 billion per year. I think HGAC requested $4 million for the region, but they had about, I think, 9 partners. They were a combination of city and counties and management districts, whoever was available. And then they had other people that submitted their support for the program. I believe the city of Houston is applying for implementation for their Vision Zero. And one of those things is to address fatalities on their high injury networks, which is a lot of them are pedestrian. Unfortunately, pedestrians in the area, fatalities vary anywhere from 20 to 30% on the network. And they're basically not crossing. Crossing is what it is. And they're not crossing at intersections, they're crossing mid-block, is what it appears to be. So with that, thank you. And if you got any questions, I'm here to answer them.
Thanks, folks. And we brought David here to talk about safety, to address a lot of these questions. You know, we've talked about safety in terms of intersections, and we evaluated the crossing. It's great to hear that we're going to think about funds, maybe to actually look at a corridor and address the crossing issue, right? Really start to target that. Thank you, David, for talking about what we're doing here at HGAC, the programs you can learn about today, but he's also being very transparent. There's a lot of things we haven't quite put together yet. And as an agency, we're trying to think, well, what programs do we need to start to incubate and make available for our region as we think about safety? And the one thing I do want to point out is when we used to talk about safety, we used to talk about just pedestrians staying off the road, right? you're getting hit because it's your fault. And so what I really like is that we're evolving and we're starting to think about, no, how do you build safe infrastructure for the user of the roadway? And now our funds are starting to follow us in that conversation. So thank you so much for that. We're going to move on. I will say, I did notice that we have some questions coming through in the chat. We are going to do one more block of speakers. And so these are going to be all of our HGAC program staff experts. And so please continue to add questions. After this is done, we will then break and allow us to ask all three speakers questions at once. So we've had Adam Beckham, who was talking about the tip and the 4 questions, now David Fink. And we were hoping to have Susan Jaworski with us today. She unfortunately told me I could share this, is that she wasn't feeling very well. She had flu-like symptoms last night, and she said, you know what, better safe than sorry. So thank you, Susan, for taking care of all of us. But no feat goes unrecognized. And so what I really want to talk about and introduce you to is this idea of the commuter transit pilot program. And Alan Rodenstein, sorry about that, who is our senior transportation planner, and he is actually in charge of this program. So the added bonus is that we get to hear directly from the master himself. And so Alan, if you'll walk us through, thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Alan Rodenstein. I'm a senior planner and the program manager for the commuter and transit pilot program. The commuter and pilot program has been around HGAC for well over 20 years. And it's mainly work on doing suburb to central city commuter bus programs. And that has been successful, and that has enhanced, especially for the regional transit agencies, the amount of suburban commuter transit into the central cities. But we're looking to do more, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. We have an open request for applications that's been open since, I believe, August of 2018, and is going to go till we extended it. It was going to close in August of 2022, and we extended it to December of 2022, where we hope to have another application that's going to be even more flexible than the one we have now. It's funded through the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality, or CMAQ, funds received by the region. We are able to do commuter transit, as we said, but we're also looking to support first mile, last mile, commute and midday solutions that can make transit possible. So we're looking at such things as micro transit, micro mobility, other things. If we can reduce congestion, or you can improve air quality, even a small amount, we will look at those projects. So we're looking beyond the more traditional projects into a different realm of projects. The project sponsor, though, must be a public agency or a nonprofit organization. It cannot be a private company, but the private company can be a partner or with the sponsoring agency. The applications are available at hgac.com on the procurement, and that's the website, and it's an 18 number because the solicitation was in 2018. Selected project, past projects, we've done something outside of the commuter. We did a project with the Energy Corridor where we did car share. And how could we justify a car share program with transit? Well, the reason we could justify it is people who are using commuter service now had a safety valve where they could get to lunch, or they could get to business appointments that they would otherwise not be able to get to because there were cars available. And that was a justification that we could quantify and could show. And so that we developed the car share program for that purpose. And that was a program that we developed. We have had some commuter successes. We had the Fort Bend County and the Medical Center expansion pilot. That was a very successful program. We've had additional runs, and it's run with a fairly full complement of passengers. It's gone down a little bit since COVID, but it still runs fairly successfully as a program. We've had Baytown to Central Business District, that grew transit service, commuter transit service from Baytown to the Central Business District. League City to Galveston, there we go, to Galveston, we've had service. And a relatively new service, although this is about 13 years old, but these are the newer services, Research Forest to Central Houston. These are some of the services in the I'd say 8 to 12 year range. Some of the current projects that we've just started are current Conroe Connection commuter transit, and this started right before COVID hit, and it's struggled, but it's still maintained, and it's actually expanded its service slightly in 2022, and has moved forward, and is starting to thrive a little bit as people are returning to work on site. And it goes to downtown and to the medical center from Conroe, which is a long trip. But there are people who take the trip, and it's an alternative to driving that long trip. We have another one which we call the first suburb travel, and that's the Woodlands Express, and that's the Woodlands to the Energy Corridor District. They must provide, as an eligible project, they must provide some sort of air quality benefit. They must provide new or expanded service. It can't be an existing service. It has to provide transit or access to transit. And it can be done in a lot of ways. It can be done for micro transit, which is transit with usually 7 or fewer vehicles. Coach, cutaway buses can do it, vehicles. It doesn't have to be a big bus. It can be smaller vehicles. And, first mile, last mile, mid support, you can do bike share, e-bike, e-scooters, shuttles, car share. You can be creative. One of the hints, though, is if you can get 0 emissions, you're going to be a long way. And in the smaller passenger vehicles, if you do 0 emissions, you're going to be a long way to getting approval, because you're really going to see an air quality benefit. It's going to be very distinct. The project award amounts we have are $150,000 to $2 million over 3 years. It can be less, but we can't approve more than $2 million based on the funding levels that we have available. Some of the frequently asked questions we have is, the pilot successful? Do I have to consider all 3 years? No, we can issue we issue 1 year renewable contracts. And anytime you can give a 30-day notice to stop the project. So if the project isn't going well and you say, well, we thought this would work, but nobody's riding, you can give a 30-day notice. We hope you don't do that, and we don't want that to happen. We want these pilot projects to be a success, but that can happen. Can I continue the project beyond 3 years? Yes, but then you have the amount reserved for the 3rd year needs to be less, and then we can stretch it over to 4 or 5 years. Are internal combustion vehicles allowed? Yes, they are, but 0 emission vehicles, as stated, they're much more available in funding now. Electric vehicles specifically, but also hydrogen vehicles can provide a general air quality benefit to make your application more competitive. And finally, can a private entity apply for a grant? No, they cannot. Only government agencies and nonprofits, and that we've had submissions of private agencies, and they're simply a non-compliant application if they come in. And I can provide any technical assistance if you are interested in applying for a grant, and the application is a little dated, and we're trying to get an updated application, but we'll still work with you to try to get an acceptable application. And if you have any questions, any difficulties, we'll work with you in person or by video, any way we can to get that to work. And that concludes the presentation. I'm glad to take any questions.
So we'll hold questions, actually. So I know we have a couple, and I've seen a couple come through the chat. But I just Alan's passion for transit is so transparent. And so it's wonderful to see that. I'm always amazed at how many folks do not know about the pilot project funds that are available that allow you to test whether or not you can actually carry transit in your community. And as he mentioned, it comes in all frames and sizes. It's not just buses. Quickly though, moving on, the next thing we really want to jump into is another part of our, we actually now have an active transportation group here at HGAC. It used to be called the Ped Bike Coordinator, but that's expanded to now a full group because we have so much going on here in the region. I'm really honored to have Chris Whaley here today. He works directly with Susan. He is a planner here at HGAC, and he is going to lead us through the next couple of slides. Chris? Thank you.
Yeah, so Anita said, my name is Chris Whaley. I am a planner here with HGAC, working both on bike ped and transit. And so I'm going to talk about mostly focus on the counter program and also give a brief overview sort of what the active transportation group works on. So yeah, so this slide lists just some general bullet points of broad projects that the three of us on staff on the Ped Bike or active transportation section do. So the first, long range policy and planning development. So what that concludes, like you see the cover for the 2045 active transportation plan. So that's the supplement to our larger regional, the 2045 RTP. We also do work on initiatives that are underway nationwide, such as like Vision Zero. The second bullet there, the Ped Bike counter program, so I'll get into that much more in the following slides. But that's collecting the equipment and the data collected for basically any non-motorized users throughout the region. We also have the Ped Bike subcommittee, which reports directly to the TAC, and that includes three working groups under that. We also offer several adult bicycle safety initiatives. So that includes both courses that you can take online, and we're also working on courses that are on hands-on and in person. And we also have 4 local active transportation studies. So those are funded through our Unified Planning Work Program, or UPWP. And then sort of on an as needed basis, I think for any of these, we can apply to what Alan was talking about, that like the technical support and training. So moving into the specifics on the counter program. So this is really referring to both the data collected and then the equipment used for that. So this is, again, like I said, this is collecting movements of non-motorized traffic throughout the region. So it's sort of done both, support existing needs. So that's really to give the borrower just sort of a snapshot on the ground of wherever they're going, the equipment is deployed. And sort of looking more long-term, we thought about using it as for studies or grant applications to get before and after, where the focus of the project or improvement is some kind of improvement specifically to allow accommodation for active transportation users. So as I mentioned, yeah, we have 2 types of equipment used to capture this data. So on the left, we have what we call mobile counters. So these are intended for short duration counts. So usually about 2 weeks at the minimum to about a month. It's pretty simple technology. So it's operated by several AA batteries, which go in the battery pack. And it uses an infrared sensor. The manufacturer calls it an infrared scope. So it uses infrared technology. So what that's doing, so it's not sensing motion, it's really looking at differences in heat signatures of anyone passing. I believe it's 5 to 10 feet is about the range. And then on the right is one of what we call our permanent or continuous counters. So that's the one we have on Brays Bayou, right by University of Houston. So this one is a little more sophisticated. So it uses 2 separate sensors. So again, the manufacturer called it a pyrosensor, but it's the same infrared sensor as the mobile counters use. And then it's coupled with inductive loops. So these are actually cut into the ground. These are wires that generate a magnetic field. So when the metal in the bike frame passes by and disturbs that, that's how it registers a bicyclist. So this offers the advantage. It can give you a total traffic, but it can also do a mode split. And we have, we're in the process of rolling out new counters for, specifically for those short duration counts. And what this graphic summarizes is the steps and the processes, basically from beginning to end, to basically set it up, collect the data, and then get the data into an exportable or usable product. So as you can see, so I tried to highlight basically the HGAC tasks that we take on are in red, and then what the borrower is expected to do is in the blue. So you can see the traffics counters are much more, it's a longer, more intensive process, and it requires much more input on our part as well. So the vision is to basically the mobile counters we have purchased and are planning to roll out soon are that they basically sort of combine the best of both worlds for what I showed on the last slide, so the short duration with the technology and sophistication of the permanent sites. So those would have a modem in it, so it could actually transmit the data automatically. Because right now, that's one thing that we have to do that is only done on an as needed basis for the current mobile counters. So yeah, and we are basically in the process. So what the holdup on that is that basically you have, if you've seen the inductive loops that they do for like AADT counts, basically the equipment we have uses those and has those in combination with that same infrared sensor. So you can have the mode split in a short-term counter. So that requires basically more equipment to install, more liability on our part. So we are working that out, but we hope to have that out soon. So this is info on what is actually required on a potential borrower to do to actually set up and use the equipment. So we have 6 of the traffic counters. So for the short-term counts. So we have the bit.ly link or the QR code. Those will both go to the same place, which is the survey. So that's where you fill out sort of just the basics about you, where you want to use the counters, the time and date and whatnot. So that's how you initialize that process. So again, I guess given that the theme here is sort of funding, I will say the counter, there is no fee to use them, and staff, usually meaning me or one of my colleagues, are available to actually help set up and remove the counters and facilitate the data collection process and all of that. The only stipulation, sort of what Alan was saying, is it's basically the same, those same requirements. You issue either a public agency or a nonprofit. So we've had, like, for example, we've had the Goodman Corp. They have borrowed them, but they partnered, I believe it was, with local TERS. So it was a project, they were doing a count for a project that Goodman was doing, but the TERS, I mean, was the actual one we made the agreement with to borrow. So I guess that's the one, that is the one sort of hoop to jump through or restriction. And then also for all existing data, again, from both these short-term deployments as well as the continuous counts are available at that URL below. So what we've done currently and have done in the past is we just do just sort of a static PDF report. We are working on having basically a tool on our website which would allow any member of the public to go in and select, at least for those long-term sites, and they could be able to go and select the site, the date range, and then the type of traffic they want to measure, and they would be able to download that in a spreadsheet format. So currently it is possible to get that data, but it has to be done on a case-by-case basis by coordinating with myself. And this map shows the historical use of those mobile counters. I believe it's over 200 unique sites over about the past 10 years. And again, it crosses, you can see there's this cluster sort of up in the Woodlands. Both Galveston and Brazoria counties have also had their fair share of sites. And then this map shows the existing permanent counter locations. So again, they're not, I mean, they're all in within the same county and within the city of Houston limits. And that is one thing we are aware of as we look to expand the program. On that note, we have we went through a procurement process to buy new equipment, and one of the things we had to determine was where we wanted to place them. So we put out a call again to the Ped Bike Subcommittee. We put out a call first to their members, and then we extended that to all, I believe all incorporated municipalities in the region, to ask them for their sort of desirable, or like in a perfect world, where would you like to have counting sites and counting equipment. So we got, I think it was 9 or 10 different entities responded and provided just about 150 locations. So it was my job to basically develop a scoring criteria and matrix and whittle that down to the 4 counters that we had purchased. So that's all I have. I'm happy to take any questions or other comments, but.
Thank you. Thank you. And as I mentioned, we'll be taking questions in just a bit. I know we have a couple that now have come through the chat. I know we have some in the room, and we do this just to make sure we can move the workshop forward, because I know there's a lot of passion in this room. And it's such a great program. This is a free program where you can actually borrow the counters, set them up, and this is great for grants, whether you're going to be applying for a grant and you want to show use, or you've applied and implemented a grant and you want to show success. So please use us. The reports are great, and Chris is wonderful to work with. They wanted me to quickly talk about our what we call our Activity Connectivity Explorer tool. This is a tool that was actually created in partnership with livable centers, and it's a free online tool that looks a lot like Google Earth, except that it's layered with multiple layers of data that are free for your use. And so if you were to go to HGAC's portal and try to download the data, you can do that as well, except that this is sort of an on-the-fly tool that doesn't require you to even know that much GIS or graphic information system. If you can use Google Earth, you can use ACE. And what it does is, again, it's an Activity Connectivity Explorer. And what it does, it actually maps out our housing within the city of Houston, within the HGAC area, as well as our job activity. So housing density, job activity, and it overlays it on top of our transportation network. So the connectivity aspect of things. It includes things like our sidewalk layer here within our entire region. And so Susan did a great job kind of saying, well, why do we have the ACE tool and why would you want to use it? Well, one, it's free, so that's always great. And then 2, you can actually create on the fly data analytics just by drawing your own boundary to your own project area. So you don't even have to have a shapefile. You can actively create it on this tool same time, and we ask you to use it when you're creating your applications. Within your handouts, you may have seen, actually I placed one at the edge of every table. It's a bit robust, and Susan did a fantastic job walking you through how you use the ACE tool. We have a couple that are at the table as well, and if anybody would like a copy, Wendy has placed it also electronically in today's chat for today's meeting, and we will follow up with an email as well, because we want to make sure you guys have access to this data. It is free, please use it. So some of the layers Susan really wanted to highlight was our regional bikeways. So we include things like the bikeways we see at the city of Houston, but not just the city of Houston, right? We're planning for bikeways across our region. It includes, I mentioned, the sidewalk inventory, as well as our transit system, whether it be rail, bus, or other. And as I mentioned, the land uses, and of course, livable centers. What I loved seeing in the one graphic that Chris was showing was, 5 of our past livable centers were actively engaged and requesting permanent counters within their communities, right? One, they know this program exists, so I'm glad you guys are here today, but they're also taking advantage of using their plans to understand where counters should go and why. So when we talk about ACE, you can actually do on-the-fly analytics as well, right? So it depends on the question you want to ask this tool. So an accessibility score. That is how accessible is your community. Some people hear walk score, so that might be a way to compare it. Sidewalk density index, right? As I mentioned, we have an entire sidewalk network for all of our counties here within the MPO. And you can actually start to say, well, do we have the right density of sidewalks that allow us to think about things like transit, for example? And then we also have ped bike commuter analysis. So we are also looking at things like pedestrian mode shift, right? And that's typically something that you have to talk about with certain types of grant applications. So we want you to have the data you need to do that. And then of course, the livable centers need index. This was something that we introduced to the region about 2 years ago. And we actually introduced it with the livable centers call for projects, where we were really wanting to make sure that we were distributing funds in an equitable way. And so this allows us to look at and understand vulnerable population demographics within our region. And through the call, and through different programs here at HGAC, we've used it in ways to help identify and distribute funds in a more equitable manner. So again, that's a free tool. And we ask you to, I have Susan here, and this is her contact information, but obviously we're a team, and you can reach out to any of the individuals who have spoken today. So I know people have been itching to ask questions, and so thank you for bearing with us again as we think about time management with our workshop today. But Gary, I think I saw your hand up. Would you like to ask the first question?
Thank you so much, and thank you for all the information. This question is for Alan. If you could, how does HGAC view broadly the difference between a private versus a nonprofit?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. A private is a for-profit company, and a nonprofit is a company. It is company, but it is nonprofit. It is not designed to make a profit. So it's that simple. And usually we will look at that. We will look at that. A management district, for example, would certainly be a nonprofit company. A nonprofit would be could be a bicycle firm that is designated as a nonprofit. That would be an important consideration. Certainly, any municipalities or transit agencies would be also governmental agencies, and hence would be qualified. Yes. No, yes.
So the question was, would HOA be considered, and would HOA be considered? And the answer was yes.
Yes.
Alan, can you expand upon, so if you are a public entity and you are working with, say, a consultant firm that therefore is private, how does that work?
The agency that is the sponsor would be the one who we would enter into a contract with. We would not enter into a contract with the private agency, and they would have to be some sort of interlocal or agreement or some sort of contractual agreement with the private agency, and that would be the responsibility of the sponsoring contract. What role they would have would be determined by the sponsoring agency.
Thank you, Alan.
I think too, it's the tax status. So if the 501c3, I think that, because I had asked the question for my purposes too, for the car park, and I can't remember who gave it, but yeah, I asked if it was that tax status, and that I think it's like to the strictest standard. I think that's what we use to determine a nonprofit.
Perfect, thank you. And then my only expansion would be for developers. If a developer was working on a project and they wanted to go out and do bike counts, as long as it's a government entity representing the application, then they can partner with different entities here within our region. We're just turning on our mics, folks who are listening online.
In fact, public-private agencies, public partnerships are encouraged. But they cannot be, again, the private agency cannot be the sponsoring agency.
Great,
It's just not allowed under the federal guidelines.
thank you. I see we have one more question.
I have a comment about Alan's talk. That a lot of people don't realize that those park and ride buses that Metro has, you can charge your phone on many of them. The 2500 series, the 2400 series, some new 2000 series buses have them under each seat. And I use that a lot because I'm over 70 years old now, so I get to ride Metro free on the train and on the buses. And I go out to some park and rides sometimes just to get myself familiar with them. And people I know didn't know that there is a bus like Cypress. I told a lady, she said, oh no, I don't use Metro, I live inside. I said, oh man, they have a park and ride out there. And there's a J.C. Penney near the park and ride. And somebody said, that's the bus lady, that's my nickname. She said, Miss Janice knows what she's talking about. And I said, these other people are not helping you because maybe they couldn't afford to live where you live. And so they're not gonna give you the information that you need. And I've been riding the bus all my life and my nickname is the bus lady. And when I told her things, I said, there's a school over there, and there's a J.C. Penney, there's a cafeteria, Luby's, and a movie theater. And she knew I knew what I was talking about. And then she said, but well, if one of my children gets sick, she has 4 and her parents take care of him. Well, I said, ma'am, that is a contingency plan Metro has 3 times per year. If you need to leave in the middle of the day or something for some family medical emergency or something, you can do that. Okay. And I told her how you do that. And she wasn't aware that that's not a problem if you do have something that comes up. And I know for a fact, because I've been on some helping other people learn how to ride, and getting their children to go to summer school classes and stuff, that there are chargers underneath the seats. You have free Wi-Fi and other amenities that people just don't know that are available. So get your little behind on the park and ride and save some money.
I love the advertisement from when people tell me, you know, who rides transit, talk about the bus lady,
That's
right?
right.
Perfect example. We definitely do.
That's
Thank you for
right.
that.
And it saves them money and everything. So I did notice that when he was talking about the park and ride bus, it's like, oh yeah, and people don't know, you can charge your phone, you can take a nap, you can do whatever you like while you're on that trip. So it's like, don't get that stigma of like, oh, they riding the bus. No, I've been riding the bus all my life. Thank you, Rosa Parks,
Yeah.
for ensuring that future generations are able to benefit from that. So I want to mention that to people. If you haven't tried it, look, you'll see all these places that the park and rides go to, and you can be productive if you wish to be.
I think what I'm hearing is pilot a program so that we can continue riding transit. So actually with that, we do have a couple more questions and we're getting back to the tip. And so Adam, these are going to be for you. Feel free to turn on your microphone and then answer from here. But there's actually 3 questions. So I'll release them and you'll let me know if you need me to repeat one. But the first one was, does HGAC have TxDOT? Does HGAC have TxDOT managed tip projects is one question. And then the next one is regarding the self-screening. On slide number 4, does the location of your project qualify for federal funding? So I guess if you are on that map, then you automatically qualify for federal funding is the question.
All right, so the first question, does TxDOT have TxDOT managed projects in the tip? Yes. TxDOT is considered a project sponsor in the region. So they also compete in our calls for projects, as well as TxDOT also has their own funding source for transportation projects. And one of the prerequisites for a lot of that is that it has to go through our transportation improvement program, as well as be listed in our regional transportation plan. So we do have a lot of TxDOT projects in our system. And the other question?
The other question was referring to the map.
The map. So there's a lot of nuance to that. So if you're building a roadway based project, if it has a huge impact on, if you're moving concrete, then for those types of projects, yes, it has to be on the federal functional classification system. And the statewide planning map is where all of that is. So there's a link. I think we put a link in there. There's a link in there that they can follow to see kind of what their federal functional classification system is. So there's different rules for different funding categories. So it kind of depends on the project that you're trying to build, and then we kind of drill down to where it is on the facility. And then there's different rules for projects that are out considered rural or in our rural area. So there's different, so it kind of just depends on what the project is and like I said, where it is. But yes, you want to make sure that it is listed somewhere in there. And if it's not, then that's something, if it isn't on the functional classification system, because it may be a new roadway or a new facility of some type, then that's something there's a statewide process that we have to go through to get that map updated. So hopefully that answers the question.
I believe it does. And for that person who asked it, please let us know if you need further clarification. The next question, and Adam, this one's geared to you also. Is it necessary to complete the environmental study required to submit with a TIP application?
No, it is not necessary. However, that does tell HJC, it gives us some indicator on the readiness of the project. So that helps us to determine, is this a project that should go in the short term, which is in the next 0 to 5 years? If it's something that maybe is kind of in a midterm, in that 5 to 10 year timeframe, or if it's something that there's not a lot of detail at all, but there's definitely a need, then that's something that goes out to our longer range planning efforts. So environmental clearance is not required to get in the pipeline, but it is a requirement to get to receive the federal funds ultimately. So.
Wonderful. And if you all remember, Adam did show that one graphic, and it was sort of a box on top of a box on top of a box, and it showed kind of the 4 to 5 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that when we're going back to our very first presenter, it was one of those things where, you know, if you have to do an environmental assessment or you don't own your right of way, these are just things to consider. It's not that you can't apply. It's just that maybe you won't be receiving funding in the next 4 years. Maybe you have to do some planning work associated with it. So we'll put you in sort of that 10-year time frame. And it's just something to think about. It's not that you can't do it. It just means you just should be aware of the time that it's going to take in the dedication of
Right.
that. Would you say that's fair, Adam?
That's very fair.
Okay. And then we have another question. Let's see, this is going to go towards David. David, how are you focusing on speeding and running red lights? Aren't these the biggest cause of crashes? And doesn't increasing turning radius of intersections allow for more speed and not less?
Well, increasing the radius at intersections, these were county roads, and their radius was not sufficiently good for turning safely because people would go out into the other lane. That's the reason for that radius increase. As far as addressing speeding and stuff like that, that would be through the STEP program that TxDOT runs, where they give dedicated funds or grants to law enforcement agencies to address things like DWI enforcement, red light running, speeding, seatbelt usage, and other things. So they put grants out there to concentrate on ticketing for that. And then the other thing is public outreach, trying to educate the public out there not to drink and drive. The other program we have for the drink and drive that the state is running is during the holidays, they have free Lyft rides up to $20 that they do. The Metro does allow you to ride the bus for free during those times. So those are the other initiatives out there.
Yeah, and I enjoyed the question, and I think it kind of gets to that discussion around what does the word safety mean. And so I do think safety is enforcement, as David's talking about. But what's really interesting with the programs that David's creating is that now we're actually starting to think about design as opposed to just enforcement. And so that's what's interesting about these new programs that are coming online. David, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, again, TxDOT's having a series of webinar on how to address safety. And one of those is roadway design and street calming. So they had a presenter that showed street calming on a roadway in Oakland, and they're going to be transferring that to Texas, but 90% of the vehicles on that roadway were speeding, and after they redid the design, they created pathways, safe pathways for bicyclists, pedestrians, and then slowed the speeds down basically to less than 20% of the people were speeding on that roadway. So that's what we're looking at as far as design elements on also.
All right, any other questions before we move on? I know we're getting close to lunch and this is about when time people get a little antsy. Yes.
Oh, thank you. I had a comment in the presentations. We have to be aware of our brothers and sisters who are differently abled, myself included now, that you're not around people in wheelchairs a lot necessarily. And so you don't think about when you're on the roadway, like this morning, when I was crossing the street to go to a bus stop, someone was turning right on red. And I said, hey, my light was still green. And they looked around and I said, I have a green light. And so it startled them, but people forget about those of us who are rolling. I know we talked about bikes and pedestrians and children's car seats. Don't forget those people who are rolling on a walker like I have or a wheelchair. And we need extra time in many cases to get across the street, and the light changes when you're not quite there. And I'm very lucky. I have people who will say, here, ma'am, let me help you get across, and then they'll stop the traffic. That we need to include rolling people too.
So I will say I did not plant her. She's here of her own free will, but that is the best transition. Thank you to the bus lady, and since you use the term, I will too.
Yes.
To talk about that, because it's actually going to segue into, we're trying to be transparent here, right? We want to talk about what HGAC is now considering in the future as we think about how to start funding these projects. And, our hope was Ali Isbell, who's the assistant director here at HGAC over transportation, was hoping to be here today. Unfortunately, she had a family issue pop up this morning. And so I'm going to do my best to represent her today. If you have any other questions, though, the one thing I will tell you is that we are actually getting task force together to think about these upcoming programs. So anything that I cannot answer here, and I have Adam Beckham who's going to help me field questions and also generate questions. But we are going to record those. And the intent is that anything we can't answer here, we definitely want to get to it. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and jump into it. So as many of you know, the Infrastructure Investment Job Act was signed into law late last year with $1.2 trillion in total spending, of which $550 billion is new spending, including infrastructure improvements to power, water, and broadband. With this new act, there's a number of new programs, but there are also several programs that continue from the FAST Act, which we all know about, with some slight revisions to details, and that includes things like spending and eligibility requirements and criteria. So we show you this slide to show you that as a regional MPO, we serve as a gateway to these programs such as the Safe Streets and Roads programs for all, as well as the Railroad Highway Crossing Program, project grants, and all of these we're actively tracking. And we want to show you this to show you, who can qualify for what, and that it's on our radar. So the first one I want to talk about, and David talked about it a bit in his presentation. I'm going to briefly go over these programs that HGAC again is actively seeking. The first is the Safe Streets and Roads for All program, which gets into the Safe Streets for All. So thank you for the segue into talking about this SS4A grant. This is a new discretionary grant program which funds local initiatives to prevent death and serious injury in a locality. As an MPO, HGA is seeking funds as a joint applicant. So David also mentioned that with this, HGAC was the lead applicant and we applied in partnership with 9 other local entities. And it's with the intent of developing a comprehensive safety action plan, commonly referred to as sometimes a Vision Zero plan. So at HGAC, we've adopted a policy. We hope to do something, and this is part of it. Now we're going to try to go for a plan. HGAC's joint application demonstrates regional cooperation and coordination priorities with the grantor, who is the Federal Highway Administration. That was one thing they wanted to see. What are the partnerships within your joint application? So that each region could be awarded the maximum amount without having to compete among themselves through this grant process. So as mentioned, that was due yesterday, and HGAC did submit. The announcement of potential grant funds are anticipated as soon as January of 2023, but an official timeline is not yet announced. Any award will be announced at HGAC's TAC, which is our Transportation Advisory Council, or our TPC, which is our Transportation Policy Council, and they will actually act as our guiding board through this process as we write this plan. It's important to note that this program will provide $1 billion per year for the next 5 years. And if we're quick enough, we can reapply for design funds and then move forward to hopefully implementation funds one day. So again, we'll continue to progress. The next slides I'm actually going to move through a little bit quicker because one, as I mentioned, it's close to lunch and I can start to see the gloss over with some of my in-persons. I can't imagine what my virtual group is doing. So really this is to kind of tell you the next 3 slides, we are not the lead applicant for, we are just considering them. And we don't know what shape this is going to take yet, but we want to make you aware of it because if you want to learn more, tap into our TPC or our TAC or send us an email, right? We want to make sure that we are addressing the right concerns here in our region. And so I think the railway highway crossing program is one that we're already starting to see in the East End, for example. There's a lot of importance going on here. This is going to be $245 million over the next 5 years. This is a continuation of the FAST Act. So this is a program that is acknowledged and needed. And what's really great about this next set of funds is that the federal share is 100%. So if these funds do become available, the federal shares are 100%. You can go to grants.gov to learn more about it. And thank you to David Fink. We know that the application should be due around October 2022. And so that is up and coming and around the corner, so more to come. The next one that we're actively tracking is the National Highway Freight Program. You know, the city of Houston and the Houston region, whenever you look at traffic, what do you think of? You think of that freight movement and the delay of goods, whether it's by rail that's blocking our mobility passage. I keep pointing to the East End because I know that's what they're actively working on. Or if it's on the highway and congestion, right? So we were trying to think about this freight movement. And what we really love about this program is they're starting to think about intermodal transfers and intermodal locations. So where should that go? Why and how does that look? So that's really interesting to now see freight starting to take that on. And you can easily see how that might connect to active transportation. The last one seems to not be on here, but I will just talk about it. It's called the Project Formula Program. And this is a new program. I received notification about it just yesterday, to be honest. And this is, we're really trying to promote resilience and thinking about, so project actually stands for Promoting Resilient Operations for Transformative, Efficient and Cost-Saving Transportation, or PROTECT. And this is a formula program. So the idea here is that we can actually, eligible projects include things like highways, but also transit projects. And guess what? Pedestrian and bicycle facilities. So now we're really starting to move, where we're starting to connect ourselves not only to freight, but also resilience. And so active transportation is on the move, and we just kind of wanted to let you know that those are out there and that we are actively looking for them. So I apologize, I'm not Ali Isbell. I tried my hardest to represent her today. So if she's watching, wherever she's at, I hope she's proud. And with that, again, we will field any questions we can from either online or the audience. If you have a show of hands, that will help me. If not, I think, Adam, is there anything you want to add? If not, I think we.
That's it's a lot of
Sure.
information though.
Awesome, awesome. Wendy, really quickly, any questions? Okay, yes.
Yes. When this gentleman here was talking about drunk driving and whatnot, and I don't see our elected officials considering let them ride Metro.
Right.
Because many of them, they'll lose their job, they can't get to work, but let them ride Metro, and that can be a form of punishment, if you will, that.
And then they
Somebody
might
said
enjoy
that's-
it. Yeah.
Somebody told me, no, that's cruel and unusual punishment, Ms. Janice. No, it's not. But where they're not driving a car and driving drunk and what have you. And I did ride in a car one time with a gentleman who I worked late for them volunteering. He was gonna take me to my bus stop downtown to get home. And there was something in the ignition that he had to blow into something and he had to be, yeah, okay. And so he couldn't drive, the car wouldn't start if that didn't work.
Right.
And so there are options, let them ride Metro. Okay, then you'll see how it feel, okay?
I like it. So, this is just a reminder, you can't build a project in a vacuum. You have to have the programs and policies there to incentivize the use of that project, the use of that corridor, the use of that sidewalk, the use of that bus, right? So however, there's a stick and there's sugar, right? It depends on how you get there. So guys, we are at the end of our time here. For the virtual community that stayed with us, thank you. And for the folks in the room, thank you. This is just a quick reminder that we have this ACE tool. Please use it. It is 100% free. We also have a wealth of information, including commuting patterns, and then our interactive tool online. So if you become a Livable Center local sponsor in the future, we actually track this for you and then update it. And you can get all your information about your center and how you're growing here. And then we're sharing knowledge, right? So these are all the resources that we've created over the years by doing workshops just like this. And today you're leaving us, because of your interest, we now have 4 additional documents, including our self-screening tool that we've generated and that we will email out to everyone just to make sure that we have a copy. And again, I promised you this at the end, you are eligible now for 3 AICP continuing maintenance credits, and here is your QR code. So with that, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate your time today.